Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The darkness here isn't like city darkness. In the city, darkness is diluted, polluted with the glow of streetlights and neon signs. Here, on this isolated farm nestled between rolling hills and dense forest, darkness is absolute. It's a living thing that breathes and shifts and watches. I know this because I've felt its eyes on me since the day I arrived. At first, I thought it was simply the adjustment to rural solitude after years of urban chaos, the photographer in me appreciating the stark contrast. Now I understand that I was never truly alone here. Something waited for me, has always been waiting, and the photos I've taken are proof that I'm not imagining things. Nobody believes me yet. Soon they won't have a choice. I purchased the Blackwood Farm property 3 months ago, seeking isolation to complete my photography book on abandoned rural architecture. After 15 years of cramped apartments and crowded streets in Chicago, the sprawling 40-acre property with its dilapidated 19th century farmhouse seemed perfect. My agent thought I was having a midlife crisis at 38. My ex-wife called it typical Martin escapism. Perhaps they were right, but the price was absurdly low, and the realtor's nervous demeanor when showing me the property only intrigued me more. When I asked why the previous owners had left, she muttered something about family troubles and a desire to move closer to the city. The way her eyes darted toward the tree line told me there was more to the story. I didn't press her. The isolation was exactly what I wanted. No neighbors for miles, spotty cell reception, and landscapes untouched by modern development. Perfect for an artist seeking inspiration and escape. The first week passed uneventfully as I settled in, cleaning decades of dust from the creaking floorboards and replacing broken windows. I set up my darkroom in the basement, enjoying the irony of developing film in the gloom beneath a house that had witnessed over a century of history. The problems began subtly on the 8th night. I was reviewing negatives when I first heard it. My name whispered so faintly I thought it was just the wind slipping through cracks in the foundation. Martin. A soft exhalation, almost reverent. I ignored it, blaming my imagination and the unfamiliar night sounds of the countryside. But it came again, slightly louder. Martin. I searched the house room by room with my flashlight, finding nothing but dust motes floating in the beam. In the following days, I immersed myself in work, photographing the weathered barn, the overgrown fields, the gnarled oak trees that formed a natural boundary along the eastern edge of the property. Through my viewfinder, I occasionally caught glimpses of something just out of focus, a blur of movement at the periphery, a shadow where no shadow should be. The developed photographs showed nothing unusual, and I dismissed the occurrences as tricks of light or wildlife. Then the whispers became nightly visitors. Always my name, always when I was alone in the dark. Sometimes from the hallway outside my bedroom, sometimes seemingly from inside the closet. I installed motion-activated cameras throughout the house, convinced that the farmhouse's reputation had attracted local teenagers playing pranks. The footage showed nothing but empty rooms, yet the whispers continued, increasingly insistent. My sleep deteriorated. Bags formed under my eyes and my hands began to tremble slightly when adjusting my camera settings. I told myself it was sleep deprivation, nothing more. The isolation I had craved now felt oppressive, the silence between whispers stretching like over-tightened piano wire. The discovery happened during my 4th week. I was clearing the overgrown garden behind the house when my shovel struck something solid about 2 feet below the surface. Expecting a rock, I instead unearthed a small wooden box, its surface covered in strange symbols carved into the aged wood. My heart pounded as I brushed away the clinging soil, a strange excitement overriding my better judgment. The box was sealed with rusted metal clasps that broke easily under pressure. Inside lay an amulet, a circular stone pendant, dark as midnight and cold to the touch despite the warm spring air. It was wrapped in what looked like leather, but with an unusual texture that made my skin crawl. A folded piece of yellowed paper accompanied it, covered in faded handwriting. The note described the amulet as a binding stone that had been sealed away for the protection of all who dwell here. The writer warned never to remove the leather wrapping or to bring the amulet inside any dwelling. I should have heeded those words. Instead, I brought it into my studio, fascinated by its unusual appearance. I photographed it extensively, capturing the intricate symbols etched into its surface. When I developed the images, my blood turned to ice. In every photo of the amulet, a faint figure stood behind me. A tall, emaciated humanoid shape with unnaturally long limbs and eyes that reflected the flash as featureless white orbs. I frantically checked the studio, finding myself alone. That night, the whispers changed. No longer just my name, but full sentences too quiet to comprehend, like a radio tuned between stations. I sealed the amulet back in its box and buried it exactly where I'd found it, my hands trembling so badly I nearly dropped the shovel several times. My mouth was desert dry, and sweat soaked through my shirt despite the cool evening air. It made no difference. The entity had been acknowledged, given attention, and perhaps that was all it needed. The next morning, I found handprints on the ceiling above my bed. Not childlike impressions, but large, distorted marks with elongated fingers, as though something had braced itself above me while I slept. My throat constricted at the sight, and I stood frozen, staring upward as my pulse hammered in my ears. I tried to photograph the handprints for evidence, but they never appeared in the images, just blank ceiling. Yet new prints appeared every night, always in different positions, creating a grotesque map of my movements during sleep. I began taking sleeping pills to escape consciousness, but they only trapped me in nightmares where I was paralyzed as a figure with white eyes crawled across my ceiling. After 6 weeks at Blackwood Farm, I developed my latest landscape photos and discovered the figure had followed me outdoors. It stood at the edge of every frame, sometimes half hidden behind trees, sometimes boldly in the open fields, but always staring directly at the camera with those empty white eyes. The rational part of my mind crumbled a little more with each new photograph. One afternoon, I contacted the previous owners, tracking them down through county records. The elderly woman who answered sounded resigned when I introduced myself as the new owner of Blackwood Farm. When I described what I'd been experiencing, she didn't express surprise or disbelief. Instead, she asked if I'd found anything buried on the property. Her family had owned the farm for generations, she explained, serving as caretakers rather than mere farmers. They had maintained certain boundaries and followed specific rituals passed down through generations to keep it contained. The amulet, she told me in a voice barely above a whisper, was one of several binding objects that kept the entity from fully materializing. By removing it, even temporarily, I had weakened the barriers. When I asked what exactly I was dealing with, she fell silent for so long I thought the call had dropped. Finally, she said they never gave it a name for fear of making it stronger, but local indigenous peoples had called the land the watching place long before white settlers arrived. She refused to return to the property, but suggested finding the remaining binding objects: a silver mirror buried near the well, a box of bones beneath the oldest oak tree, and a jar of preserved herbs inside the north wall of the barn. These items, properly arranged, might restore the weakened boundaries. I spent days searching, my camera always ready, documenting my efforts. The entity appeared in more photographs, each time closer, more defined. In the most recent images, I could make out the texture of its skin, like bark stretched over bone, and the unnatural angle of its joints. My dark room became a gallery of horror, a visual record of its approach. The mirror was where she'd said, tarnished but intact. The box of bones proved harder to locate, the old oak having spread its roots widely over decades. The herb jar remained elusive despite my tearing apart sections of the barn wall, leaving my hands splintered and bleeding. Last night, I woke to find my bed surrounded by wet footprints too large to be human, leading from the hallway to my bedside and back. My chest constricted as I followed them, my flashlight beam trembling across the hardwood floors. They led to the basement door, which stood open despite my having locked it before bed. In the dark room, I found all my photographs altered. The entity no longer lurked at the edges. It had been edited out entirely. Instead, every image showed me, but with subtle wrongness. My eyes completely white, my limbs too long, my fingers distorted. A message was scratched into the developing table. I am you now. My heart slammed against my ribs as I backed out of the room. The house felt different, the air thicker, resistant to my movements. I rushed outside in my night clothes, the cool night air raising goosebumps on my arms. From the safety of my car, I watched the farmhouse, its dark windows like empty eye sockets. Nothing moved inside or out, yet I felt observed from every direction. I drove to the nearest motel and haven't returned since. It's been 24 hours. My rational mind suggests calling the police, reporting a break-in, having the property searched. But what would they find? Handprints on the ceiling? Edited photographs? They would attribute it to stress, isolation, perhaps a mental breakdown. As I write this account in this anonymous motel room, I keep checking the mirror, terrified of seeing white eyes reflected back at me. My camera sits unused on the table. I can't bear to look through its viewfinder. What might be waiting on the other side, watching me frame the shot? The elderly woman called again this morning, asking if I'd restored the bindings. When I admitted I hadn't found all the objects, she hung up immediately. My phone hasn't worked since. I should flee further, perhaps leave the state entirely. Yet something pulls me back toward Blackwood Farm, a compulsion I can't explain. I feel incomplete, as though I've left part of myself behind, or perhaps something else has filled the void. The whispers continue even here, no longer coming from outside but seeming to originate from within my own mind. Tonight I'll return to finish what I started. I need to find the herb jar, complete the binding ritual. I've studied the photographs obsessively, noting how the entity's position shifted over time, how it moved from background to foreground, from outside to inside, from the periphery of my life to its center. There's a pattern there, a message in its methodical approach. But one detail haunts me more than any other. In the very first photograph where it appeared, standing behind me as I held the amulet, I now notice something I missed before. The shadow it cast on the wall behind it doesn't match its form. The shadow is mine. I don't know what waits for me at Blackwood Farm. Perhaps the entity, perhaps answers, perhaps both. What I do know is that I can't escape it by running. Whether it's a supernatural presence or a manifestation of my own fractured psyche, it has marked me, claimed me. The binding ritual might contain it again, or it might be too late. As I pack my camera, I can't help myself. The photographer in me needs to document whatever happens. I catch my reflection in the motel mirror. For just a moment, my eyes look unusually bright, almost white in the dim light. Must be a trick of perception. Must be. The sun is setting. Time to return to Blackwood Farm. Time to face the watcher in the fields. Story 2. The first night I heard it play, I knew something was wrong. A tinkling melody that shouldn't exist anymore. Notes hanging in the air like ice crystals, sharp and lingering long after they should have faded. The music box had been silent for days after I brought it home from Grandpa's estate, its gears presumably frozen with age. But at 3:17 a.m., it decided to wake up. And so did something else. I inherited my grandfather's house 3 weeks ago. A modest 2-story Victorian on the outskirts of Millfield, the kind of place that creaks and sighs with the changing seasons. My grandfather was a watchmaker by trade, a collector of timepieces and mechanical curiosities by passion. Among his possessions was an ornate walnut music box, its surface carved with intricate patterns of leaves and vines that seemed to shift in the right light. Inside, a small brass cylinder studded with tiny pins rotated when wound, plucking delicate metal tines to create a haunting melody I couldn't quite place. The lawyer who handled the inheritance mentioned nothing unusual about the house or its contents, just the standard paperwork, keys handed over with professional courtesy, and a brief mention that my grandfather had requested I take special care of his collection. I moved in 2 days later, setting up my home office in the spare bedroom and leaving the master bedroom untouched. Something about sleeping in a dead man's bed felt wrong. especially since I barely knew him. Childhood visits had been rare, and in adulthood, they became almost non-existent. The last time I saw him was 5 years ago at a family reunion. He seemed distracted, distant, his fingers constantly tapping out rhythms on the tablecloth. I placed the music box on the mantel in the living room, alongside some of his pocket watches and a few framed family photos. The first few nights passed uneventfully as I settled in, working remotely during the day, exploring the house and surrounding property in the evenings. In the corner of the living room sat an old wooden rocking chair that I assumed was my grandmother's, though she had passed long before I was born. The curved rails on its base seemed worn unevenly, as if someone had spent years rocking in a specific pattern. I tried it once but found it uncomfortable, the back too straight, the seat too hard. On the fourth night, I woke to music. My heart hammered against my ribs as I lay perfectly still, trying to identify the source. The notes were clear, delicate, but somehow wrong, like a record played at 3/4 speed. The tempo dragged, transforming what might have been a lullaby into something mournful, desperate. I knew immediately it was the music box, though I hadn't wound it since examining it briefly upon arrival. My mouth went dry as I forced myself to leave the warmth of my bed. The wooden floor felt ice-cold beneath my bare feet as I moved toward the door, each step requiring conscious effort. The hallway stretched before me, the shadows deeper than they should have been despite the nightlight I'd plugged in near the bathroom. The melody grew louder as I descended the stairs, my hand gripping the banister with white knuckles. The living room was bathed in pale blue moonlight filtering through the thin curtains. The music box lid was open, its tiny mechanism turning steadily, gleaming in the darkness. But what froze the breath in my lungs wasn't the box. It was the rocking chair, moving, back and forth in a gentle rhythm that matched the distorted melody. Empty, yet not empty. A darkened silhouette sat there, barely visible, more an absence of light than a presence. The outline of shoulders, a head, hands resting on the arms of the chair. But no features, no substance. Just a suggestion of a person, rocking slowly as the music played. My throat constricted as I tried to call out. No sound emerged. The temperature in the room had plummeted, my exhaled breath visible in cloudy puffs. I blinked hard, convinced my sleep-addled mind was playing tricks. When I opened my eyes, the chair was still, the silhouette gone, but the music continued for exactly 37 more seconds. I counted each one, before winding down with a discordant final note that hung in the air like an unfinished sentence. I didn't sleep again that night. I convinced myself it had been a particularly vivid dream, the kind that lingers between sleep and wakefulness. My grandfather's house was old, full of settling noises and draft-induced movements. The human mind, especially one transplanted to unfamiliar surroundings, naturally seeks patterns and explanations. I repeated these rational thoughts like a mantra as I made coffee at dawn, the sky outside still purple with the last remnants of night. But the next evening I took precautions. I wound the music box fully and let it play through its entire melody while I timed it. Exactly 2 minutes and 12 seconds of a tune that sounded vaguely familiar but impossible to name. When it finished, I closed the lid firmly and placed a heavy book on top. Then I set up my laptop on the coffee table, its webcam aimed at both the music box and the rocking chair. I activated the motion detection recording software I used for home security and went to bed, exhausted but determined to prove to myself that nothing unusual was happening. At 3:17 a.m., I jolted awake again to the same melody, but slower this time, each note stretched and warped as if struggling to emerge. My skin prickled with goose flesh as I forced myself to leave my bed. I needed to see the laptop to confirm what was happening. The music pulled me down the stairs, my legs moving woodenly, my chest tight with dread. The living room was colder than before. The book I'd placed on the music box now lay on the floor. The box itself was open, its mechanism turning with agonizing slowness. And the chair, God, the chair, rocked with purpose, the silhouette more defined than the previous night. I could almost make out the slope of shoulders, the suggestion of an elderly posture. My eyes darted to my laptop, the screen black. Dead. Unplugged. though I distinctly remembered ensuring its power cord was secure. Fighting against the paralysis of fear, I lurched toward the laptop, fumbling to reconnect it. My trembling fingers knocked against the power button several times before it hummed to life. The recording software had shut down completely, but as the screen illuminated the room, the silhouette vanished, and the music box wound down with that same unresolved final note. I spent the remainder of the night hunched over the kitchen table, gulping lukewarm coffee, convincing myself to stay. In the harsh light of morning, I examined the music box more carefully. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the wood smooth beneath my fingertips. Inside the lid, I discovered a faded inscription I hadn't noticed before. For Wilhelm. The melody remains unfinished until you complete it. My grandfather's name was Thomas, not Wilhelm. I wondered if he had acquired the box from someone else, perhaps another collector. Determined to document what was happening, I purchased additional recording equipment the next day, a digital camera with night vision, a voice recorder, and motion sensors. I positioned them strategically around the living room, making sure they operated on batteries as well as outlet power. I even set up my old smartphone as another recording device, tucked behind a book on the shelf with its camera peeking out. This time, I was leaving nothing to chance. That night I struggled to fall asleep, anticipation and dread keeping my nerves jangled. I must have drifted off eventually, because once again, the music woke me precisely at 3:17 a.m. This time the melody was so distorted and slow that the notes barely connected into a coherent tune. The spaces between them stretched like taffy. The sound raised the hair on my arms and neck as I made my way downstairs. The living room was arctic, my breath forming clouds that hung suspended in the air. The silhouette in the rocking chair was more substantial, its edges more defined. I could make out the wrinkled hands gripping the armrests, the hunched posture of age. He, rocked in time with the labored melody. I stood rooted to the spot, unable to approach, unable to flee. The camera on the bookshelf emitted a high-pitched whine before going silent. The night vision camera's indicator light flashed erratically, then died. One by one, every recording device faltered and failed. But the voice recorder on the mantel, placed nearest to the music box, continued to run, its tiny red light a beacon in the darkness. And then I heard it. Beneath the distorted music, a whisper so faint I had to strain to catch the words. Complete it. You must complete it. My blood turned to ice. The voice was papery, ancient, but with a familiar cadence that triggered some deeply buried memory. It sounded like my grandfather, but not as I had known him. Older, more desperate. Complete what? I managed to croak, my voice barely audible over the slowing notes of the music box. The silhouette's head turned slightly toward me, though I still couldn't make out any features in the darkness. The rocking slowed. The melody. It's unfinished. I never. The music box wound down, the final note hanging incomplete in the frigid air. As it faded, so did the silhouette, dissolving like smoke until the rocking chair stood empty once more. The next morning, I retrieved the voice recorder with shaking hands. Every other device had malfunctioned, cameras showing only static, motion sensors triggering false alarms throughout the night. But the voice recorder had captured something. When I played it back, beneath layers of electronic hiss and interference, those same words emerged. Complete it. You must complete it. I spent the day researching music boxes, specifically those with inscriptions referencing unfinished melodies. I found nothing conclusive, just forum threads about collector's items and antique valuations. By late afternoon, I was poring over my grandfather's personal papers, which I had boxed up but never properly examined. Among them was a thin folder containing correspondence with a German craftsman named Wilhelm Schreiber. The letters, dating back to the 1970s, discussed the commission of a custom music box with a specific melody. The final letter from Schreiber, dated a month before his reported death, mentioned that the music box was nearly complete, but that the melody required the final sequence, which would be provided upon delivery, as agreed. A note in my grandfather's handwriting at the bottom of the page read simply, "Never received final sequence. Wilhelm died before completion." My skin prickled as connections formed. My grandfather had commissioned the box from a man named Wilhelm, the same name in the inscription. But Wilhelm had died before providing the complete melody. Had my grandfather somehow acquired the box anyway? And was the unfinished nature of the melody somehow keeping Wilhelm tethered? That night, I placed the music box on the coffee table directly facing the rocking chair. I left all lights on and sat in a chair opposite, waiting. At precisely 3:17 a.m., despite not being wound, the box began to play. The melody started normally this time, but as it progressed, it slowed and distorted just as before. The lights flickered, dimmed, then stabilized at a fraction of their brightness. The silhouette appeared in the rocking chair, more solid than ever. I could make out the features now. An elderly man with a deeply lined face, spectacles perched on a thin nose, white hair combed neatly to one side. He looked directly at me, his expression one of profound sorrow and yearning. "You have his blood." The whisper came, clearer now. "You can finish what he couldn't." My mouth was desert dry, sweat beading on my forehead despite the bone-deep chill. "How?" I managed to ask. "How do I complete it?" The figure gestured toward the music box. "Listen, remember, the final sequence." It came to him in dreams, but he refused, too afraid of what it would unlock. The rocking chair creaked rhythmically, the sound merging with the distorted melody in a hypnotic pattern. I found myself leaning forward, straining to understand the music, to hear what was missing. As I concentrated, something stirred in my memory, a tune my grandfather used to hum when I was very young, during those rare visits. 5 notes, always the same sequence, over and over as he worked at his watchmaker's bench. Without conscious decision, I began to hum those notes, my voice quavering in the hushed room. The music box's melody paused, as if listening. Then, to my astonishment, its mechanism adjusted, adding those exact notes to the sequence before continuing. The melody transformed, no longer distorted or slowed, but flowing with a haunting beauty that brought unexpected tears to my eyes. The silhouette in the rocking chair seemed to brighten slightly, the sorrow in his expression giving way to something like peace. "At last," he whispered, "after all these years. Thank you." The music played through once more, complete now, the final notes resolving the tension that had hung unfinished for decades. As the last note faded, the silhouette smiled, a gentle, grateful expression, and gradually dissolved, not into darkness this time, but into soft light that lingered briefly before fading entirely. The music box closed itself with a soft click. The temperature in the room gradually returned to normal. I sat motionless, my heart pounding, trying to process what had just occurred. After some time, I cautiously approached the now silent box. Opening the lid, I found the inscription had changed. It now read simply, "Melody complete, Wilhelm rests." I've kept the music box, though it never again plays on its own. Sometimes, when the house feels particularly empty, I wind it manually and let the completed melody fill the rooms. The rocking chair remains still, its occupant presumably at peace. But on certain nights, just as I'm drifting to sleep, I could swear I hear my grandfather's voice, humming those 5 notes that completed the sequence, a reminder that some compositions require generations to perfect, and some obligations transcend death itself. Story 3. And the first time I heard it, I dismissed it as the building settling. Old places make noises. They breathe and creak, especially at night when the temperature drops. The Hartwick Hotel had stood since 1924, its marble floors and ornate crown moldings witnessing nearly a century of human activity. But working night security in a historic building meant getting used to the sounds of emptiness, the peculiar acoustics of abandoned grandeur. What I couldn't explain away was the faint saxophone that drifted through the third-floor corridor at precisely 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday night in October, or the unmistakable clink of crystal glasses that followed. My name is Michael Donovan, and after 15 years as a beat cop in Chicago, I took this security job thinking it would be peaceful, a quiet transition into eventual retirement. The Hartwick was being renovated into luxury apartments, but construction had stalled due to permit issues and historical preservation concerns. My job was simple: patrol all 8 floors twice per shift, monitor the security cameras, and ensure no one entered the building without authorization. The developer was paranoid about copper theft and vandalism. I was the only one in the building from midnight to 8 a.m., with occasional overlap with day security at both ends of my shift. I'd been working at the Hartwick for 3 months before the first incident. The building had always felt unnaturally cold in certain spots, particularly the grand ballroom on the 2nd floor, but I chalked it up to drafts and an outdated HVAC system. But that Tuesday in October changed everything. The music was distant but unmistakable, not a recording playing from somewhere, but the authentic sound of live jazz, muffled as if coming through a wall. My first instinct was to call in a trespasser, but something held me back. The music faded within minutes, and I spent the rest of my shift on edge, checking and rechecking empty rooms. By week 2, my routine patrols had become investigations. The music returned, always between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m., always fading when I approached the ballroom. I began to detect other sounds: the low murmur of conversation, occasional bursts of laughter, the distinct shuffling of dancing feet. I documented everything in my log and even set up my phone to record, but the recordings never captured what my ears could hear. When I mentioned it to Rodriguez, the day guard, he laughed it off. The building was playing tricks on my mind, he said. Night shifts did that to people. The smells came next. I'd catch sudden, overwhelming whiffs of expensive perfume, followed by the acrid tang of cigarette smoke. Not modern cigarettes, but something richer, more pungent. The first time it happened, I rushed through the entire 2nd floor, convinced someone had broken in and was smoking in a closed building. But the smell would vanish as suddenly as it appeared, leaving me standing alone in empty corridors, my flashlight beam cutting through undisturbed dust. By the 4th week, I began to feel observed. The sensation of eyes tracking my movements would prickle the back of my neck. During my patrols, the temperature would drop dramatically in certain areas. My breath would cloud in front of me even though the thermostat readings remained normal. I started to avoid the ballroom entirely, taking detours on my rounds that added extra steps, but spared me from walking through that cavernous space with its massive crystal chandeliers and mirrored walls. Then came the voices, clear, direct, and terrifyingly close. "Join us for a hand?" a woman asked one night, her voice sultry and amused, floating from just behind my left shoulder as I hurried past the ballroom entrance. I whirled around, heart hammering against my ribs, but the corridor stretched empty behind me. My palms had grown instantly slick with sweat, and it took considerable effort to steady my breathing. I called out, demanding whoever was there to show themselves, but my words echoed unanswered through the building. That night, I found the card in my pocket, an ace of spades yellowed with age, its edges worn smooth. I had no memory of picking it up, no explanation for its presence. The card felt abnormally heavy in my hand, its surface cool to the touch despite having supposedly been in my pocket for hours. I locked it in my desk drawer before leaving that morning, but when I reached home and emptied my pockets, another card waited. The Queen of Hearts this time, with a faint smudge of red lipstick on one corner. Sleep became impossible. Even in my apartment, miles from the Hartwick, I would jolt awake to phantom jazz and distant laughter. My doctor prescribed sleeping pills that left me groggy, but did nothing to stop the dreams. Dreams of elegant parties where faceless figures beckoned me toward a card table in the corner. I'd wake clutching my sheets, heart racing, skin clammy with sweat. I began researching the building's history during my days off. The Hartwick had been a premier hotel in its time, and the ballroom had hosted the city's elite through the Roaring '20s and into the Great Depression. Newspaper archives mentioned high-stakes poker games held regularly in private rooms adjacent to the ballroom, games where fortunes were won and lost in single nights. Several articles alluded to a particular game in November 1932 that ended in scandal, though details were frustratingly vague. One player, a banker named William Price, had allegedly accused others of cheating before disappearing. His body was never found, but the reporter strongly implied foul play. The cards continued appearing in my pockets, never the same one twice, building a partial deck. I tried locking them in my desk, in my locker, even throwing them in the dumpster behind the building, but somehow they always returned to my possession. Rodriguez began to look at me strangely when he'd catch me talking, apparently to myself, during shift transitions. I'd be responding to comments, questions, jokes that only I could hear. The night voices had become constant companions, growing increasingly familiar, increasingly insistent that I join their game. "Just one hand, Michael," they'd whisper. "Everyone gets one chance to change their fortune." 2 months in, the visions started. Brief at first. Flashes of movement at the edge of my vision, transparent figures that disappeared when I turned to look directly at them. Then longer episodes where the empty ballroom would momentarily transform before my eyes. For fleeting seconds, I'd see it as it once was, brilliantly lit, filled with elegantly dressed men and women, tables covered in green felt, waiters carrying trays of champagne. The vision would vanish if I blinked or moved, leaving me alone again in a dusty, half-renovated space. The physical changes in me became impossible to ignore. Dark circles carved themselves under my eyes. I'd lost weight, my uniform hanging loose where it had once fit perfectly. My hands developed a constant tremor that made writing in my security log difficult. Sleep, when it came, was plagued by dreams of cards being dealt, chips stacking, and the same phrase repeated endlessly: "Just one more hand." I found the poker chip in my other pocket on a Friday night. It wasn't plastic like modern chips, but an antique made of clay, heavy and substantial, with the Hartwick's original logo embossed on both sides. That same night, the episodes increased in both frequency and duration. The ballroom would shift between past and present several times during a single patrol. I began to recognize certain figures: a woman in a red dress who always stood near the bar, a tall man with a pencil mustache who dealt cards at the corner table, a heavyset man in a pinstriped suit who watched the proceedings with a scowl. They seemed increasingly aware of my presence, some nodding in my direction, others beckoning me closer. By the 3rd month, Rodriguez requested not to overlap shifts with me anymore. He claimed my behavior made him uncomfortable. The muttering, the constant checking of my pockets, my startled reactions to sounds he couldn't hear. Management assigned a new day guard, a younger man named Torres, who asked too many questions about why I looked so exhausted, why I sometimes failed to complete all my patrol logs. He suggested I see someone professional about my episodes. His concern felt like an accusation. I began bringing a voice recorder to work, hoping to capture evidence of what I was experiencing. The recordings contained only my side of conversations. Desperate questions shouted into empty rooms, pleas for the voices to leave me alone. In one particularly disturbing recording, I found myself agreeing to something, promising I would come to the table soon, that I just needed time to prepare. The missing time started next. I'd check my watch at the beginning of a patrol, then somehow find myself in the ballroom with no memory of how I'd gotten there. An hour or more vanished from the night. During these blackouts, more items would appear on my person: a vintage matchbook from the Hartwick Hotel, a cufflink with pearl inlay, a small Art Deco flask still containing traces of Prohibition-era whiskey. During one episode, Torres found me sitting cross-legged in the middle of the ballroom floor at the end of my shift, cards arranged in a solitaire pattern before me. I have no memory of this, only his frightened face swimming into focus and his hands roughly shaking my shoulders. He reported the incident to management. They mandated a psychiatric evaluation if I wanted to keep my job. The doctor spoke of stress-induced hallucinations, of the effects of isolation and irregular sleep patterns on perception. She prescribed antipsychotics that dulled my senses, but didn't stop the voices. If anything, the medication made it harder to distinguish between what was real and what wasn't. The figures became more solid, the music louder, the smells more pungent. The line between my world and theirs grew increasingly thin. Last night, I made a decision. After weeks of their invitation, I finally responded that I would play. Just one hand, as they'd been asking. Their reaction was immediate and overwhelming. The ballroom erupted into full, vivid existence around me. No longer transparent or flickering, the scene solidified into absolute reality. The chandeliers blazed with light. Cigarette smoke hung in thick clouds near the coffered ceiling. The band played a lively Charleston while couples danced, and at the corner table, 4 players waited with an empty chair between them. The woman in the red dress approached, her perfume enveloping me as she took my arm and guided me toward the table. The cards in my pocket grew warm, almost hot, against my thigh. The heavy-set man in the pinstriped suit looked up as we approached, his scowl deepening. "You brought a modern with you, Elizabeth?" he asked, voice thick with disdain. "He has the cards," she replied simply. "They've been calling to him." The dealer with the pencil mustache smiled thinly and gestured to the empty chair. "We've been waiting for a 5th, he said, shuffling cards with supernatural dexterity. "Waiting for so long. One hand determines everything here. William never got to finish his last hand. Perhaps you'll have better luck." I knew with absolute certainty that sitting down at that table would change everything. The barrier between my world and theirs would dissolve completely. But the alternative was to continue in a half-existence, torn between realities, my grip on sanity eroding with each passing night. I took the seat. The dealer's hands moved in a blur, cards sliding across green felt. The other players watched me with hollow eyes, their faces suddenly gaunt in the chandelier light. I realized with a cold shock that they weren't merely apparitions. They were trapped, bound to this endless night, this perpetual game. William Price hadn't disappeared after accusing them of cheating. He had become part of the game itself, another ghost at the table. "The stakes?" I asked, my voice steady despite the terror gripping my chest. The dealer's smile widened, revealing too many teeth. "Why, nothing too dear," he said, his voice suddenly echoing as if from the bottom of a well. "Just time, just presence, just permanence." I looked down at the cards he'd dealt me, my hands trembling as I lifted the corners. A full house, queens and aces. A winning hand in any normal game. But as my opponents laid down their cards one by one, their expressions remained neutral, unreadable. The dealer was the last to reveal his hand. "I'm afraid fortune doesn't favor you tonight," he said, spreading a straight flush across the felt. The room began to dim around the edges, the party fading like a photograph left too long in sunlight. Only our table remained brightly lit, suspended in a void of encroaching darkness. The chips in the center of the table, my chips, melted into the green felt. The other players began to fade as well, their forms becoming transparent, their voices growing distant. "What happens now?" I asked, panic finally breaking through my voice. Elizabeth's hand came to rest on my shoulder, substantial again, her red nails digging into my flesh. "Now?" she echoed, her voice regaining its sultry tone. "Now we wait for the next player, and you, Michael, you invite them to join us for just one more hand." This morning, Torres found me unconscious on the ballroom floor, surrounded by a scattered deck of antique playing cards. The medical evaluation blamed extreme exhaustion and possible narcolepsy. I've been placed on medical leave, pending further psychiatric assessment. But I know what really happened. I escaped somehow. The game rejected me. Or perhaps another player made a more tempting target for them. I submitted my resignation today. I'm leaving the city tomorrow, putting as much distance as possible between myself and the Hartwick. But even as I pack my apartment, I can hear distant jazz playing from somewhere inside the walls. And in my pocket, a new card has appeared, the Jack of Spades, with a message scrawled in faded ink across its face. "You left too early. The game isn't finished. I don't know what happens to those who walk away from the table at the Hartwick, but I suspect with growing dread that I'll soon find out. Some games once started can never truly end." Story 4. The moment I placed that statue in my living room, the atmosphere in my apartment shifted. I could almost feel the air turn stale, as though every window had been slammed shut and sealed from the inside. The statue, carved from dark stone with intricate lines swirling around its base, emanated a strange aura even in broad daylight. In the quiet of the evening, a low hum seemed to slip into the corners of every room, barely audible but undeniably present. I tried to tell myself it was the sound of my fridge or the pipes in the walls, but deep down, I knew it came from that statue. I had brought it back from Peru, where I'd traveled for a corporate seminar followed by a short excursion arranged by local business partners. I'm an executive for an international firm, always looking to strike deals, expand networks, and secure new markets. During a break in the conference, I visited a small antique shop that specialized in rare artifacts. The shopkeeper gave me an odd grin when I expressed interest in the statue. He mentioned in hushed tones that it was supposed to bring protection, but required certain customs to maintain its blessing. I was more interested in its exotic look, something to display in my apartment to spark conversation when guests visited. Looking back, I wish I had left it there, buried under layers of local superstition. Now it's in my living room, dominating the space despite its modest size. The stone figure shows a vaguely human shape, but the features are exaggerated. Large eyes, a twisted mouth, and a posture that suggests vigilance. Its head is slightly tilted as if it's listening for a secret on the wind. I told myself it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the sensation that it was watching me, sizing me up. On the first night, I woke up in the early hours to a faint buzzing. My sheets were soaked with sweat, and I felt an odd tingling under my skin. My heart was hammering in my chest, every beat echoing in my ears. I sat up, trying to calm my breathing, and realized a wave of nausea was creeping through my gut. It was the kind of uneasy feeling that makes your whole body tremble, not from cold, but from raw, unexplainable dread. I forced myself to get out of bed and check the apartment. Every step felt heavier than the last, and a thin layer of goosebumps spread across my arms. In the living room, nothing seemed disturbed, but the statue was hard to ignore. Under the dim glow of a street lamp filtering through the window, I could have sworn it was angled differently. The hum had stopped, leaving the apartment in suffocating silence. I stood there for a moment, trying to catch my breath. My mouth had gone dry and my throat felt tight. Reason told me the statue hadn't moved, but a primal part of my mind screamed otherwise. Eventually, exhaustion overcame me, and I headed back to bed. I dreamed of strange figures dancing in a circle around a bonfire, chanting words I didn't understand. The statue was there, looming in the center, as if controlling the entire scene. When I woke up in the morning, my left forearm was riddled with fresh scratches, thin red lines as if something small and sharp had raked across my skin. My first thought was that I must have tossed and turned, scraping my arm against a rough corner of the nightstand. But the pattern didn't match. Each scratch was parallel, deliberate. My chest tightened as I tried to rationalize it, but my reflection in the bathroom mirror only filled me with more questions. My eyes looked sunken, ringed by dark circles. I splashed water on my face, noticing how my breathing turned shallow, each inhale scraping at my lungs. At work, I felt off-kilter all day, like I was just going through the motions, smiling mechanically at colleagues, responding to emails with half my mind somewhere else. I kept recalling the dream, the bonfire, the chanting, the statue's mesmerizing gaze. My assistant asked if I was feeling all right. I muttered that I was just jet-lagged. In truth, I was fighting a suffocating sense of dread that coiled around my spine. The hum still lingered in the back of my mind, even during broad daylight in a busy office. That evening, I came home determined to ignore the statue, but the moment I stepped into the living room, a chill prickled along my neck. I turned on every light I could, trying to chase away the oppressive darkness. I reminded myself that it was just a piece of carved stone, a souvenir. A few days passed, and the incidents escalated. The humming grew more distinct at night, seeping into my dreams. I started having nightmares of an ancient ritual performed on a mountaintop. The wind whipped around robed figures who bowed before the statue, chanting in guttural voices. The statue itself glowed with an unearthly light, and in the dream, I knew it demanded something vital. Whenever I jolted awake, my heart would slam so hard against my chest that it hurt. My breathing would come in ragged bursts, and beads of sweat would drip down my temples, soaking the sheets. My entire body felt drained, and each morning, new scratches or bruises appeared on my arms and torso, as if unseen hands had seized me during the night. In a state of mounting panic, I set up a security camera in the living room. I told myself I just needed proof, some logical explanation. Maybe I was sleepwalking. Maybe something else was happening. The next morning, I checked the footage. At first, everything seemed normal, but then a flicker in the frame caught my eye. The statue's head, previously tilted to the side, appeared to rotate ever so slightly, tracking motion in the room. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. My stomach roiled with nausea, and my legs felt like lead. I replayed the clip multiple times, each viewing making my pulse pound harder in my ears. I tried to show it to a friend who visited, but I ended up speaking mostly in vague terms, worried that I'd sound insane if I insisted a statue was turning its head on its own. That friend offered a half smile, suggesting maybe the camera had glitched. I didn't argue. My voice was too shaky to form a rebuttal. That night, the humming became almost unbearable. It was like a swarm of insects was buried in my walls, vibrating in a synchronized rhythm. My temples throbbed. My heart hammered so forcefully I could feel my pulse in every fingertip. I closed my eyes, but the moment sleep came, the visions returned, more vivid than before. I saw the statue beckoning me closer, the lines carved into its surface seeming to swirl and pulsate. The chanting in my dream boomed like thunder, echoing inside my skull. When I woke, I could hardly catch my breath, like the air itself was tinged with a metallic taste. Cold sweat drenched my pajamas. My limbs trembled from the overload of adrenaline. Desperate for any kind of relief, I tried to rid myself of the statue. I hauled it into my car with every intention of dumping it at a storage unit, as far from my home as possible. The entire drive, I felt as though something was looking over my shoulder from the back seat. My skin crawled, and goosebumps traveled from my neck to the base of my spine. The statue didn't make a sound, but I swore the humming lingered, vibrating in my skull. Upon reaching the storage facility, I wrestled the statue out of the trunk, my arms shaking from effort and from raw fear. With every step, my chest grew tighter, as if invisible hands were squeezing the air from my lungs. My heartbeat drummed relentlessly. I locked it away in a unit, shut the door, and rushed back to the car, trying to calm my breathing. For 2 days, I convinced myself it was over. My apartment felt emptier, and I tried to interpret that as relief. But on the third night, the hum returned, louder than ever. My nightmares flooded back, accompanied by a suffocating sensation of hands gripping my wrists. I woke up screaming into my pillow, heart thrashing, a cold sweat clinging to my body. In a half-conscious haze, I stumbled to the living room. There it was. The statue stood in the same spot I had originally placed it, as if it had never been removed. My legs nearly gave out. I grabbed my phone, scrolled through contacts, but my hands were shaking so badly I couldn't dial anyone. My breath came in ragged bursts, and a crushing sense of helplessness pinned me in place. There was no explanation for how it had returned. Panic turned to a feverish determination. If logical steps wouldn't work, I had to consider the possibility that this was beyond anything I'd ever faced. I remembered the shopkeeper's whispered warnings about customs, the words about protection requiring a price. My mind reeled with the possibility that the dreams about sacrifices weren't just hallucinations. They were some sort of psychic imprint, demanding recognition. I felt dizzy, my vision blurring at the edges. It was like the air itself pressed against me with a suffocating weight. Every nerve in my body was on high alert. I stopped going to the office. I was too on edge, too consumed by the statue's presence. My apartment became a claustrophobic maze of shadows. Every noise made me jump, pipes creaking, wind rattling the windows, the fridge humming. My spine remained tense at all hours, like I was constantly expecting something to grab me from behind. I barely slept, and when I did, the nightmares were vicious. The statue's demands in those visions were clearer now. It needed offerings, some type of ritual to appease whatever force lived inside that hunk of stone. One evening, I lit every lamp, turned on the brightest lights I had, hoping to chase away the suffocating darkness that clung to the statue. Then I sat in front of it, trying to stare it down. My heart raced so violently that my chest ached, and sweat beaded on my forehead. I had the fleeting urge to run, to flee my own home, but I forced myself to stay put. My breath came in shallow, trembling gasps. I whispered to the statue, not quite forming coherent sentences. In my desperation, I pleaded for it to leave me in peace, to lift whatever curse it had brought. My voice was shaky, hardly more than a whimper. The statue offered no reply, but the humming bore into my skull. My thoughts jumbled, and I felt my mind teetering on the brink. By the time I dragged myself to bed, I was so exhausted I could hardly undress. I collapsed onto the mattress, heart still pounding. The night passed in fragments of lucid terror. I saw myself in the same ancient ceremony from before, only now the chanting figures turned their heads toward me in unison. Their eyes glowed with intensity, and the statue stood at their center, radiating a crimson aura that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I felt that it was calling to me, demanding that I give in. When I finally jerked awake, I stumbled to the bathroom, retching into the sink. My skin was damp with sweat, and I could taste bitter saliva on my tongue. My arms shook with uncontrollable tremors, and I clung to the edge of the sink just to stay upright. The next day, after hours of pacing around in a panic, I decided to check the security footage again. My limbs trembled as I fast-forwarded through the night. Sure enough, at around 3:14 a.m., the statue twitched, its head turning slowly, tracking my movements in the darkness. I saw myself walk into the living room with a kind of mechanical stiffness, as if sleepwalking. Then, right there on camera, I lifted my arm to the statue, and in the dim light, the statue's mouth seemed to stretch into an unnatural grin. I watched, horrified, as my own body flinched repeatedly, though nothing visibly touched me. My stomach churned and I reached up, feeling fresh welts on my arm. My vision swam with confusion. My sanity threatened to splinter. I knew then that fleeing wasn't the solution. The statue would follow. I could almost sense it in my bones. That humming in my head wouldn't let me escape. With my last shred of resolve, I gathered a few items: cleansing herbs from a local store, a small bowl of water, and a candle. I had no expertise, but I was desperate. The environment in my apartment was stifling. My lungs felt heavy, and the walls seemed to loom closer than ever. The hum grew louder, more insistent, like it was mocking my attempts to fight back. I knelt on the floor, facing the statue. My heart thundered in my ears, and my breath came in short, jagged bursts. In a trembling voice, I recited any words I thought might help, a jumbled fusion of half-remembered prayers and the shopkeeper's vague warnings. The candlelight flickered against the statue's stony surface. It seemed to watch me intently. My spine tingled, and cold sweat formed on my brow. I poured water over the base of the statue, holding my breath as I did it. There was a faint hiss, almost like steam escaping. But it could have been my imagination. My hands shook so badly that droplets splashed onto the floor. I sprinkled the herbs around it, trying to summon the courage to keep going, although my knees felt as if they'd buckle at any second. A wave of dizziness washed over me. My eyesight blurred, and I felt a heavy pressure in my chest. The hum crescendoed, rattling in my skull until I thought my head would split. In that moment, I felt a strange resistance, like an invisible force pushing back. My arms trembled, and my teeth chattered. A strangled sound escaped my throat as I fought for control of my own body. And then, as suddenly as it rose, the pressure receded. The hum faded to a distant drone, still present but subdued. Cautiously, I opened my eyes. The candle still burned, the herbs lay scattered on the floor, and the statue remained. But somehow the atmosphere was different, less suffocating, at least for now. My heart still pounded, yet the frantic terror had ebbed to a tense alertness. I picked myself up, swaying on unsteady legs. A deep exhaustion seeped into my muscles. My breath was still shallow, but I could inhale without the choking sense of doom. I stood there for a long time, muscles twitching from the intensity of what I'd just experienced. Had I performed some sort of ritual to keep it at bay? Or had I merely delayed the inevitable? The statue stared back silently, no longer humming, but no less imposing. My skin crawled under its gaze, and a cold sweat continued to dampen my shirt. In the back of my mind, I realized this might never truly be over. It was as if the statue had acknowledged my attempt to confront it and was momentarily satisfied, no longer demanding sacrifices, but not entirely relenting either. Gathering the camera's memory card, I replayed the scene of me confronting the statue. Nothing in the footage explained the surge of force I'd felt, nor did it capture the low hum that had plagued me. I still saw the statue move, if only slightly, but the tape was grainy and inconclusive. No one else would believe me. I had no solid evidence, just an unshakable certainty that I was dealing with something beyond reason or science. Even now, I can't say I've found peace. The nights remain restless, and I still wake up drenched in sweat, eyes darting around the room, searching for any sign of motion. Sometimes, I think I hear the hum creeping back in, like a distant vibration in the walls. My fingers still tremble when I catch sight of the statue's twisted face. It's as if it's waiting, quietly biding its time. I don't feel entirely free. More like I'm sharing my space with a volatile force, one that can be pacified for a while but never fully dispelled. I keep the lights on whenever possible. I've started leaving the television running through the night, hoping the sound masks that faint buzzing. I avoid looking at the statue directly for too long, but I'm also afraid to turn my back on it. My body remains on alert, every nerve cell primed for the slightest disturbance, my heartbeat sometimes skipping a beat when the air conditioning kicks on or a branch taps the window. I'm planning to move soon, though a part of me fears the statue will simply reappear in the new place. My mind races with questions that seem to have no answers. Is this statue linked to an ancient entity, or is it merely a conduit for a force that thrives on fear? The shopkeeper hinted at a sacrifice. Perhaps I thwarted it, or perhaps I only postponed the inevitable. The uncertainty gnaws at me, corroding any sense of safety I once knew. For now, though, the humming stays low, and the scratches on my arms have stopped. It's been a week since the last fresh mark, but every night, before I fall into a fitful sleep, I see the swirling patterns of that old ritual in my mind's eye. I hear the chant, guttural and droning, and I feel the statue's presence hovering at the edge of my consciousness. Some nights I think I glimpse the statue's head move out of the corner of my eye, and my heart lurches in my chest. Whether it's truly moving or just a trick of my fatigued brain, I can't tell anymore. My hands shake, my throat goes dry, and a cold sweat breaks out along my hairline. Fear rattles my thoughts and paranoia creeps in, whispering that I'll never truly escape it. I wish I could end this with a neat resolution, shatter the statue and be rid of it, or consign it back to the place I found it. But it's not that simple. My experience suggests it's not bound by normal rules. Still, I cling to the faintest hope that my confrontation offered some temporary reprieve. Perhaps that's enough for now. Even if the weight of its gaze still lingers, even if the uneasy hush hangs in the air, I'm still here. My mind may be battered, but I haven't surrendered. And in that small victory, as precarious as it feels, I find a flicker of defiance. I can't say what tomorrow will bring. The statue remains perched on its pedestal, silent yet impossibly alert. Whenever I pass by, I sense its stare drilling into my back. My heart rate spikes, and my palms turn clammy. I remind myself to breathe, to hold on to the fragile sense of control I gained in that desperate ritual, because that's all I have. A tenuous grip on sanity, a resolve forged by terror. And though the shadows still feel oppressive and the nights still drip with unease, I've learned to live with the disquiet. That hum, low as it might be, remains a reminder that some forces can't be locked away or easily destroyed. They linger in the corners of the mind in the dead of night, waiting to be acknowledged, waiting for the next slip in your defenses when fear alone might be enough to let them in once more. Story 5. I felt something was wrong with this house from the moment I stepped inside. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and the dusty windows let in just enough light to make the corners seem darker than they had any right to be. My pulse quickened as soon as I turned the key in the lock, and a thin layer of sweat formed on my palms, though it was cool outside. Even then I told myself it was just nerves. My new project was massive, and the place needed a complete renovation. But deep inside, I sensed a lurking presence, as if the walls had secrets they were desperate to unveil. I had no idea how right I was. I moved in to oversee the remodeling personally. As an architect, I relished the chance to resurrect old structures, preserve their historical essence, and merge it with modern designs. But this building exuded a kind of hush that made my hair stand on end. I remember spending my first night wandering the halls with a flashlight, my footsteps echoing in the silence. At the far end of the corridor, the wallpaper peeled in an unsightly flap, revealing some faint lines beneath. I made a mental note to check it in the morning. When the day arrived, I prepared my toolbox and carefully peeled back the decaying wallpaper. What I found made my mouth go dry. A symbol carved directly into the plaster, all sharp angles and twisted curves, emerged like a scar. The lines were uneven and crudely etched, reminiscent of archaic runes I had once seen in an old library book but couldn't place precisely. I ran my fingertips over the carving, feeling its grooves, the tiny flakes of crumbling wall clinging to my skin. My heart pounded so fiercely that it throbbed in my ears. There was something deeply unsettling in the shape. No, not just unsettling. It felt wrong. I recall backing away, a wave of nausea rolling through my gut. In my work, I've uncovered hidden compartments, discovered cryptic notes, even stumbled upon old diaries. Yet I'd never felt threatened by anything I found. This was different. I snapped a few photos for research and tried to forget about it for the rest of the day. But the image wouldn't leave my mind. Later that afternoon, when I closed my eyes to rest, I saw that symbol burned into my vision, like a dark afterimage on my eyelids. I wanted to keep things professional, so I told myself I was overreacting. The next few days passed in a blur of structural assessments and phone calls to contractors. Yet every time I stepped into that hallway, the carved symbol drew my gaze like a magnet. Eventually, I decided to remove it. I reasoned that it would be better to replaster the wall entirely. So I scraped it away, piece by piece, covering the dust with a cloth until the shape vanished. But in the process, it felt like I was stripping away something far more sinister than plaster. My teeth chattered as I worked, and I was certain, without logical justification, that someone was watching me from the shadows. My breathing grew shallow, and the hammer in my hand trembled. Still, I pressed on, forcing myself to believe that finishing the task would banish the sense of unease. That night I slept in the master bedroom upstairs. The wind outside barely stirred, yet I kept hearing a faint rasp against the walls, like a slow, deliberate scratching. A heavy pressure settled on my chest, and I kept waking up with my heart drumming a wild rhythm. Each time I opened my eyes, I thought I saw a faint shape flicker in the dark corner near the closet. My logical side insisted it was just my mind playing tricks, a product of stress and exhaustion. I even laughed bitterly at myself, trying to break the tension. But the feeling lingered that something was in the room with me, peering at me from behind that closed closet door. The first true hallucination struck me in the middle of a sunny afternoon. I was painting a test patch in the living room when I caught a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision. I turned my head, the brush still dripping in my hand. By the doorway, I saw a figure, a human silhouette with a face that looked smeared, distorted, like a painting rinsed with turpentine. My pulse hammered in my temples and my lungs seized. It was gone in less than a second, but I was left standing there, paint spattering onto the tarp, feeling a raw jolt of fear. My fingers went numb, and I nearly dropped the brush. I remember gasping for air, blinking repeatedly, and telling myself that it had to be a trick of the light. Within a week, these apparitions grew more frequent. My neighbors, who occasionally checked on the project's progress, mentioned that they sometimes saw me in the yard at night, pacing, gesturing, as though locked in conversation with someone. I had no memory of these events. One morning, an older neighbor came by to see if I was all right. She said she had watched me for nearly an hour the previous evening, whispering to the empty air near the big oak tree by the fence. My stomach clenched so tightly that I had to grip the door frame. I tried to explain that I must have been sleepwalking, but she gave me a worried look and left, clearly unconvinced. My paranoia soared. I installed cameras around the house, hoping to catch any sign of these nightly wanderings. Yet every time I checked the footage, my figure appeared as a dark shape moving at the edges, sometimes glancing over its shoulder like it sensed the camera. It never faced the lens directly, never revealed my expression. That only deepened my sense of dread. I found myself shaking uncontrollably when I tried to analyze the clips, searching for any clue about who or what I was talking to. But the real shock came when I decided to place a voice recorder by my bed at night. I had grown tired of my restless sleep, waking up drenched in cold sweat, my heart pounding, convinced I heard footsteps circling my bed. The first morning I listened back, there was only the sound of my uneven breathing for hours on end. Then, at around 2 in the morning, a whisper, definitely not my voice, drifted through the speaker. The tongue was guttural and harsh, like broken glass rattling in the throat. My blood ran cold. I turned the volume up, my breath catching painfully in my chest, and heard the faint syllables. They were words I couldn't understand. The recorder hissed, and then my own voice mumbled something in response, equally unintelligible. It was as if I was answering something from within a dream, trapped in that half-conscious realm where logic dissolves. The next nights, the recordings became more disturbing. The foreign voice grew louder, the cadence more insistent. My answers sounded more desperate. I could hear my own breath quivering between the phrases. It was like a conversation, but it didn't align with any language I knew. I started to dread the evenings, feeling a sharp anxiety every time the sun dipped below the horizon. I double-checked that the doors were locked and the curtains were drawn, though I had no idea what good that would do against something intangible. My heart pounded so hard that I could feel each beat resonating in my skull, and my mouth turned so dry it felt like sandpaper. Often, I caught myself standing still in the hallway, paralyzed by the thought of nightfall coming again. As the days dragged on, the hallucinations in the house intensified. I saw more figures with those distorted faces, lurking at the edges of my vision. They would stare from dark corners, behind open doors, or from the reflection in windows. My chest tightened every time I saw that warped grin or the twisted shape of their eyes. My entire body would tense, a rush of adrenaline surging through my veins. I started to sweat profusely and tremble. A persistent sense of being watched settled over me like a suffocating blanket. Sometimes I spun around, fully expecting to confront a stranger in my house, yet I always found empty air. I tried rationalizing it. Stress, lack of sleep, and the overwhelming workload were taking a toll on my psyche. I took breaks, walked around the block, forced myself to eat properly, but each night, the recordings confirmed that something shared my space, something that spoke in a voice that was not mine. My neighbors kept their distance, disturbed by my odd behavior. One of them mentioned that they heard chanting from my backyard on a couple of nights, though they couldn't make out the words. I recalled none of it. My fear escalated into a kind of raw panic that gnawed at me in the quiet moments, leaving me with clammy palms and a near-constant knot in my gut. Desperate, I researched the symbol I had removed. I combed through libraries and online forums, searching for anything resembling its design. Late one evening, after hours of fruitless scrolling, I found a cryptic reference to an ancient script said to be tied to the Watchers Beyond, described as entities that remain hidden until called forth by a specific sign. The single image I located bore a striking resemblance to the shape under the wallpaper. Reading it sent a sharp jolt of terror through me. I could feel my pulse thundering in my neck, a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. The text explained that once the mark was revealed and destroyed improperly, a doorway was essentially forced open, inviting things that did not belong in our realm. My breathing turned ragged, and I shut the book or tab, refusing to read on. I knew I had to do something about the house before it broke me completely. I began second-guessing my reality. Were these visitors illusions, or were they real in some twisted sense? My reflection in the bathroom mirror became a stranger. My eyes were sunken, dark circles etched beneath them, and my skin looked pallid. My hands shook so badly that I had difficulty shaving some mornings. I felt as though I was unraveling, a puppet dancing on the strings of some malevolent force. My mind churned with fear, and I wondered if perhaps I was simply going insane. But the marks on the audio recordings told me there was more at play than mere madness. I decided to recover the place where the symbol had been, but this time I tried to do it respectfully. Following the vague hints I had gleaned from old texts, I mixed a special sealant containing salt and chalk into the plaster. I muttered half-remembered lines from the obscure references I'd read, part prayer, part incantation, though I'm not sure who or what I was trying to communicate with. The entire time, I felt goosebumps rising on my arms, my breath hitching, as if invisible eyes were fixed on every twitch of my muscles. That night, I didn't record myself. I couldn't bear to, but I still woke up in a panic around 3 in the morning, a terrified scream dying in my throat as I bolted upright in bed. I was shaking uncontrollably, drenched in sweat, my heart slamming against my ribs. My bedroom was in complete darkness, yet I sensed movement near the door, like a figure slipping away the moment I opened my eyes. My mind screamed at me to turn on the light, but it felt like my limbs were made of lead. After what felt like an eternity, I managed to switch on the bedside lamp. The room was empty, though the air had that stale, charged quality, as if someone had just been there. Over the following days, something seemed to shift. The nightly episodes in the backyard ceased, at least according to the neighbors who, by then, watched me warily from behind curtains. My hallucinations grew less frequent, though I couldn't shake the conviction that I was never truly alone in the house. Sometimes I still caught fleeting shadows at the edges of my vision, but they no longer lingered to taunt me with their faceless stares. The voice on the recordings, though I forced myself to listen to older files, remained as evidence that something unearthly had attached itself to this place, or perhaps to me. Eventually, I reached a breaking point. I packed up my essentials and decided to leave the renovation unfinished for a while. I told myself it was a break to clear my head, to regain some sanity. As I walked through the corridors for what I intended to be the last time, I paused near the wall where that symbol once lay hidden. My heart pounded, and my legs felt weak, but I forced myself to press a hand against the fresh plaster. It felt cool and solid. I whispered under my breath that I was sorry for disturbing whatever lay beneath. My throat was tight, and my voice trembled so much that my teeth nearly chattered. I had a strange sense that the house, or something inside it, was listening, gauging my sincerity. When I finally stepped outside, the daylight felt disorienting, almost blinding. My ears rang and my skin prickled, as if I had just emerged from a stifling cave. I got into my car, turned the key, and drove away without looking in the rearview mirror. My heart was still hammering, my breath short, my mind swimming with the memory of those distorted faces peering at me from corners and doorways. I felt certain that I carried a piece of this haunting with me, lodged deep like a splinter under my skin. I'd like to say that leaving the house brought immediate peace. It didn't. Some nights I still wake up gasping, absolutely sure I can hear that rasping voice in my ear, speaking words I cannot understand. My body breaks out in a cold sweat, and my pulse races so violently that I can feel it in my fingertips. I see shapes in my peripheral vision every now and then, just dark blurs that fade the moment I turn to confront them. I'm trying to move on, but a lingering suspicion clings to me. Once you've glimpsed that shadowy boundary where our world bleeds into the unknown, it never fully lets go. In the end, I survived, though I'm not entirely certain if the danger is truly over or simply waiting. My mind remains restless, haunted by the voice that invaded my dreams, and by the memory of the symbol I foolishly unearthed. Even now, I question whether I escaped the thing that was awakened, or if it followed me. The sense of being watched, of something brushing against the edges of my consciousness, hasn't disappeared completely. Though I've tried to rationalize, the fear continues to burrow deeper. My heart still beats just a little too quickly when the house crosses my mind. If there is any lesson in what happened, I suppose it's to tread carefully where the unknown dwells. Some walls hide more than just crumbling plaster, and when you peel back those layers, you might discover something that isn't meant to be disturbed. While I haven't gone back to finish the renovations, a part of me knows I might have to return someday. The thought alone twists my stomach into anxious knots. Perhaps that place still carries echoes of my presence. Or maybe it waits, hungry for the chance to whisper in my ear once again. Until then, I live with the uneasy truth that the walls we build can hide countless secrets, and sometimes those secrets are eager to be found. Story 6. The first time I laid eyes on the painting, I felt an immediate chill spread through my spine, as though the air around me had turned frigid in an instant. I was in a secluded art gallery in a part of town where the lights always seemed to flicker and the streets echoed with every footstep. The room smelled of old varnish and stale air. Something about that painting, displayed under a single weak bulb, demanded my attention. It showed a dark corridor with barely discernible figures in the background, their outlines blurred, as if the paint itself was uncertain about their shape. At the time, I dismissed the odd sensation as a trick of my mind, just an overactive imagination provoked by the eerie ambiance of that neglected gallery. Little did I know, that moment would mark the beginning of a horror that I still struggle to understand. I am a collector. By no means am I wealthy, but art has always been my sanctuary from a world that feels devoid of meaning. I gravitate toward works that speak to me on some visceral level, and that night, the painting felt like it was speaking a warning in a language I couldn't decipher. There was no plaque, no name of the piece, just a handwritten price tag that seemed oddly low for something so captivating. I paid without question. The gallery owner didn't say much, only mentioned in a hushed tone that the artist had vanished right after finishing that particular piece. He added that many potential buyers found it unsettling. He left the rest unsaid, but I noticed a tension in his jaw, as though he was relieved to rid himself of the painting. That first week, I hung it in my living room. My apartment is small, with creaky floorboards and dim corners. Often, my own reflection in the window at night unsettles me, but nothing had ever disturbed my peace the way this canvas did. By daylight, it was almost mundane. A dark corridor, shadowy silhouettes, walls that seemed to stretch out too far. But in the evening, under the soft glow of my lamp, I began to sense changes in the details. Subtle ones at first. The silhouettes moved a fraction to the right, or the corridor appeared an inch narrower. My eyes would linger on it, and I'd feel my heart rate spike as if my body instinctively recognized something vile unfolding. Each time I told myself it was just the interplay of light and shadow. The mind, I reasoned, can be tricked when it stares too long at something vaguely defined. Then came the second week, when I started noticing it displayed scenes from my daily life, but always a day in advance. I nearly dropped my coffee mug the morning I glimpsed a faint shape in the foreground wearing the same coat I had worn the day before. Except it made no sense. It matched the coat I was about to wear that day, a coat I had laid out on a chair but hadn't put on yet. My stomach knotted and a cold sweat dotted my forehead. I told myself I was imagining coincidences. I tried to ignore the painting for the rest of the day, staying out of the living room and convincing myself I just needed more sleep. Yet by evening I found myself drawn to it again, like a helpless spectator to a silent film that predicted my next move. The following night I saw something unmistakable. It portrayed me, in my own kitchen, reaching into the top cupboard for a glass. The details were shockingly accurate. My hair, my posture, my expression of mild frustration. I recognized every nuance. I could barely breathe. My mouth went dry, and a clammy tension enveloped me. It was as if the painting had spied on me from some vantage point beyond normal perception. The next morning, in a daze, I repeated the same action, opening the cupboard for a glass. My mind raced with jumbled panic, replaying what I'd seen on the canvas. Was I genuinely living out the painting's premonitions, or was the painting reflecting my life after it happened, and my memory was fooling me? Doubt gnawed at me, but deep down, I knew these images were forming a day before they occurred in real life. My hands trembled whenever I approached the painting, and my heart thundered in my chest. Even the small squeaks of the floorboards under my feet seemed unnaturally loud, each step a heavy reminder that something was profoundly wrong. The corridor in the painting grew more defined, the walls more textured. I could see patterns in the bricks and almost identify a faint glistening of water stains, as though it were a real place where dampness crept up from hidden leaks. But what shook me the most was the slow transformation in the center. It was less of a corridor and more of an opening now, like the painting was developing a depth that couldn't be explained by simple perspective. Some nights I swore it was becoming a portal. At times I thought I could see faint movement behind the paint, like a presence pushing from the other side. I developed a habit of turning the painting to face the wall before I went to sleep, but by morning, it was always angled differently, no matter how securely I left it. My skin would crawl with the realization that I was not alone, and I'd become hyper-aware of every creak and whisper in my apartment. A few weeks in, the nightmares began. I would wake up gasping for air, my chest tight, and a sheen of sweat covering my entire body. I had vivid dreams of a pale hand clawing at the canvas, scraping layers of paint as it tried to emerge into the real world. In these dreams, the corridor extended into a swirling darkness, and the hand would beckon me closer. I'd feel my pulse racing, terror flooding my veins, but my body would move against my will. I'd step closer until I was almost touching the surface. Then I'd jerk awake, my heart hammering. The darkness of my room felt alive, as if the painting's presence had seeped into the walls, turning my safe space into a cage for unseen eyes. I decided to seek out information about the artist. My anxiety had evolved into a frantic need for answers. Through a series of phone calls and meandering conversations, always couched as casual inquiries, I discovered that the artist had abruptly disappeared. Nobody could provide any concrete leads. Some believed he had traveled abroad. Others speculated he had gone mad and vanished into obscurity. Most admitted he was secretive, prone to working late into the night. A gallery attendant offered one unnerving detail. The artist had once claimed he wasn't creating the painting, but rather discovering it, as if uncovering something that already existed. Hearing this, I felt the hair on my arms prickle, and a clammy sensation spread through me. My breathing grew shallow, and I realized I was gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles were white. Every night the painting seemed more warped, more alive. Its dimensions felt inconsistent. Sometimes, standing inches away, I sensed a cool draft on my face, as though the corridor had an internal breeze. My mind started playing tricks, or so I told myself. I would catch glimpses out of the corner of my eye of a hand coiled in the shadows on the canvas, only to find it gone when I turned to look directly. I felt eyes on me. Even in other rooms, I could sense an unnatural presence emanating from that cursed thing. My muscles would tense involuntarily, and I found myself constantly turning corners with caution, half expecting something monstrous to be waiting in ambush. Then there were the nights of the full moon. During the first full moon after I brought the painting home, I woke up around 3 in the morning. The apartment was silent, yet I felt an indescribable dread that pressed down on my chest. Every nerve was on edge, as if my body was signaling imminent danger. When I forced myself out of bed and into the hallway, I saw the painting glowing faintly in the dark. There was no lamp on, no moonlight hitting it directly, yet it shimmered as if lit from within. My lungs felt constricted, and the cold sweat was instantaneous, soaking the back of my neck. I approached it, each step more difficult than the last. I could hear my pulse throbbing in my ears. A dryness coated my tongue, and my hands shook uncontrollably. That was the first time I saw the hand pushing through. The surface of the canvas bulged, as though the painting's texture had transformed into a pliable membrane. The pale, bony fingers tore at the air, gripping the edges of the painting in an attempt to pull itself out. No direct sound emerged, but I swore I felt vibrations, a low thrumming that reverberated in my chest, like a muffled groan from somewhere far away. My entire body felt paralyzed by terror. I remember a single flicker of a thought. Run. But I couldn't. My feet rooted to the spot, and my throat was too tight to even let out a gasp. Then, just as suddenly, the hand slipped back into the canvas, dissolving into the swirling darkness within the corridor. The painting returned to its usual flat form, though the corridor seemed to swirl with faint wisps of smoke that disappeared moments later. I stood there, heart pounding, a bead of sweat rolling down the side of my face. I didn't manage to sleep the rest of the night. Every subsequent full moon repeated this horror. Each time the hand grew more substantial, and the edges of the canvas pulsed with an otherworldly glow. Sleep became impossible. The nights bled into days, each filled with a constant dread that gnawed at my sanity. My perception of reality started to fragment. I would jump at my own reflection, hallucinate faint shapes in my peripheral vision. Sometimes I caught my breath in ragged gasps, my chest aching with an unshakable sense of doom. Desperate, I tried everything I could think of. I covered the painting with a heavy blanket, only to find it thrown off by the next morning as though an invisible force had ripped it away. I even removed it from the wall and shoved it into a storage closet, barricading the door with furniture. Yet whenever a new day began, the painting was somehow back on the living room wall, perched as if it had never been moved. My heart would pound violently each time I discovered it there. I started to question if I was dreaming, or if the painting possessed some unimaginable power to defy physical restraints. My reflection in the mirror seemed hollow, my eyes ringed with dark circles. I looked haunted, barely able to eat, forced to sip water to quell the dryness in my mouth, all while noticing my fingers tremble incessantly. I had fleeting thoughts of destroying the painting, but every time the idea crossed my mind, an overwhelming dread spiked through me, paralyzing me before I could follow through. It felt as though I was being manipulated by the presence within. I recalled rumors. The painting wasn't just cursed, but in some way living. Any attempt to damage it might open a door even wider. Maybe that was the point all along. It wanted me to try something rash, to tear open the boundary completely. The visions on the canvas continued. Scenes from my future daily life kept appearing, always one day before they occurred. Sometimes they were trivial glimpses, me unlocking my door, me pouring cereal. Other times they were more chilling. I saw myself frantically crawling across the floor, away from something I couldn't quite see. And the next day, something would spook me. Maybe a fleeting shadow or a sudden noise, and I'd find myself crumpled on the floor in the same position. It was never a direct replay of a major incident, more like micro moments of horrifying déjà vu. Each time, my breath would catch in my throat, and my skin would break out in cold sweat. One night, after I had barely slept for days, I watched the painting shift before my eyes. The corridor had become more like a tunnel, extending backward into swirling blackness. I sensed that if I kept staring, I might see the place that hand came from, a dimension not meant for human understanding. My chest tightened so painfully I thought my heart might burst. My breathing turned shallow and harsh. I had to force my eyes away, pressing them shut until stars formed behind my eyelids, while my entire body trembled in primal fear. As another full moon approached, I realized I could no longer endure the cycle of dread. My only recourse was to confront it directly, to face the painting in the fullness of its hideous power. The night of the full moon came. I braced myself in the living room, lights off, my pulse thrumming like a war drum. I stood just a few feet away from the canvas, my legs weak, slicked with cold perspiration. A stifling hush pervaded the room. I wanted to scream, but my throat felt constricted. As the clock struck midnight, the painting glowed again, illuminating the living room with a sickly radiance. The hand emerged, more defined than ever, veins pulsing along its translucent skin. My instincts told me to retreat, yet I stood firm, adrenaline coursing through me. Slowly, I reached out, my fingertips trembling uncontrollably. The air around the painting was ice cold, burning my hand with its frigid intensity. The corridor on the canvas twisted, and the hand gripped the edge. For an instant, I felt it brush my arm, cold as death but undeniably alive. In that moment, a surge of clarity broke through my terror. I realized it wanted me to recoil, to open myself to deeper fear. Instead, with a final burst of desperate courage, I shut my eyes and shoved the painting face first into the wall. I heard a faint hiss, more psychic than physical, as if I had severed a direct link to that other realm. My heart pounded so violently I thought it might give out. I stood there, body trembling, sweat dripping from my forehead as the glow faded behind the canvas. The air felt heavy with an unseen force, but gradually, it thinned, leaving behind an oppressive quiet. When I finally stepped back, I expected the painting to have reverted to its original state, or perhaps to display that same corridor. But it was pitch black, empty, as if the paint had dissolved into darkness. For the next 3 nights, I remained vigilant. The painting didn't move from its face-down position. No hand emerged. No future scenes appeared. I barely slept, unsure if this was merely a temporary calm. On the 4th day, I flipped the canvas over. It was blank, just a canvas surface with discolored patches where the original paint had been. Though I'm still gripped by occasional nightmares and unexplained chills, I believe I have severed that particular link. Yet part of me suspects the painting is not truly gone. Sometimes out of the corner of my eye, I glimpse an odd shape on the blank canvas, a faint swirl of color that disappears when I blink. My heart never ceases its frenetic rhythm during these moments. I catch myself listening for the slightest sound, waiting for a distant hiss or the scrape of nails along the surface. Each night the shadows in my apartment still feel alive, and the mere act of walking through the living room can make my pulse skyrocket. I don't know if I'm safe. There's no way to be certain, but I do know that the painting is no longer the same. It lies there, stripped of its cursed image. Whether I merely suppressed whatever lived inside it or whether it's waiting for the right time to return, I cannot say. A lingering dread follows me, a constant sense that my sanctuary has been compromised. I leave lights on now, as if brightness alone can stave off the encroaching darkness. My nights remain restless, punctuated by flashes of that pale hand. I can feel it in my bones. This is not a clean escape, but a stalemate between the unknown and me. That, perhaps, is the most haunting realization of all, that some doors, once opened, can never really be closed, and some horrors, once unleashed, remain forever on the edge of our vision, ready to lunge the moment we let our guard down. Story 7. I knew something was deeply wrong the moment I set foot in that cramped apartment. The air felt thick, as if every wall exhaled stale breath into the tiny living room. The overhead light flickered in faint intervals, casting jittery shadows on the peeling wallpaper. There was no sense of warmth or comfort, just an oppressive stillness that pressed down on my shoulders. In the first few seconds alone, I was certain I should never have signed the lease, but desperation had pushed me to ignore every red flag. That was my first mistake. I write for a living. I'm not a best-selling author, but I managed to scrape by on short stories and the occasional magazine piece. When I moved into this apartment, I was certain it would be just a temporary arrangement, a quiet place where I could finish a longer manuscript without the usual distractions. The rent was surprisingly low. The landlord said it was because the building was old and not well maintained. I convinced myself I could handle some creaky floors, flaking paint, and questionable heating. If I had known what lay ahead, no bargain in the world would have convinced me to cross that threshold. From the beginning, something felt off. It wasn't just the old pipes or the outdated wiring. There was a perpetual feeling of being watched. On my very first night, I was awakened by what sounded like slow, deliberate footsteps overhead. It seemed as though someone was pacing back and forth. I checked the time on my phone, 3:12 a.m. The landlord had told me that the unit above mine was vacant, so the footsteps made no sense. I told myself it must be the old building settling, but a chill settled in my spine that wouldn't go away. The next day, I tried to continue working on my manuscript. I remember writing a sentence about my protagonist's fear of the dark, something about flickering lights in a cold hallway. Then I heard it, a soft whisper, rising from somewhere within the walls. It was almost indistinguishable from the faint whir of the heater, but I caught snippets of words that seemed to echo my own text. My ears strained to make sense of the hushed sounds, but they were gone in an instant, replaced by the normal hum of city traffic outside. I rubbed my tired eyes and assumed my overactive imagination was playing tricks on me. Over the following nights, the footsteps returned, but this time they had a purposeful rhythm, as if each step was part of some careful ritual. I tried to ignore them, burying myself in my work, though every hair on my neck stood on end. The building was old, I repeated to myself. Floorboards creaked, pipes groaned, and the wind could swirl in the strangest ways. Yet I couldn't shake the gut feeling that these sounds were deliberate and that they followed me from room to room. If I moved to the bedroom, the steps seemed to shift above that space. If I relocated to the living room, they circled that ceiling instead. Then the whispers got bolder. No longer fleeting murmurs buried beneath the sound of traffic. They became distinct threads of phrases that coincided with the words I was typing. When I tried to describe my protagonist's sense of loneliness, I heard a hoarse voice in the wall finishing the sentence for me. Shocked, I stopped typing mid-sentence, and the whisper faded into silence, as though it had never existed. My heart pounded so hard I could feel my pulse in my fingertips. Sweat beaded on my brow, and I found myself looking around the room, expecting to see someone hidden behind the bookcases or crouched behind the couch. Nothing. No one. With every passing day, my anxiety skyrocketed. I began to dread the moment the sun went down, certain that each night would bring me closer to something I wasn't prepared to face. My breaths often came in uneven gasps. My mouth felt perpetually dry, and a tight knot of fear took permanent residence in my gut. I started sleeping with every light in the apartment turned on, even though I knew it would cost me extra on the electric bill. Illuminating the corners, I thought, would keep the shadows at bay. But the oppressive atmosphere only intensified under the glaring bulbs, like spotlighting a stage where I was the unwitting actor in some twisted production. One morning, I approached my desk to find that the last paragraph I had written was no longer the same. Words had been replaced, and entire sentences bore a style completely alien to me. The handwriting on the page had shifted into a jagged scrawl that I could scarcely read. I stood there in numb disbelief. My stomach churned as though I'd been poisoned, and my hands turned clammy. I tried to rationalize what I saw. Maybe I had dozed off and written in my sleep, or I was under so much stress that I simply forgot making those changes. Yet the more I stared at the unusual letters, the more I was certain they were not my doing. The words seemed to sneer back at me, as though mocking my confusion. I considered emailing a friend to ask if I could crash on his couch for a few days. When I tried to leave the apartment to get some fresh air, I discovered the front door wouldn't budge. I checked the locks, twisted and yanked the handle, but it was as if the door frame had swollen around the door itself. In a moment of near panic, I kicked at it, only to have it remain stubbornly in place. My heart thumped wildly, and my breath quickened so much that I nearly hyperventilated. I looked through the peephole, hoping to catch sight of a neighbor, but the hallway lights were off. All I could see was darkness. Eventually, I told myself I had to remain calm. I took slow, measured breaths, forcing my racing mind to find some kind of logic. I reasoned the old building must have a warped door, or maybe I had locked it incorrectly. I even contemplated contacting the landlord, but my phone refused to connect whenever I was inside. The few times I tried to call from near the window, I got no signal. My nerves felt like live wires, crackling with tension. Nightfall came again, and the footsteps overhead grew louder than ever. This time, instead of that slow, methodical pacing, they scurried like frantic animals. It sounded as if multiple sets of feet were rushing around, each one heavier than the last. My pulse quickened with each thump. I sat on my couch, eyes fixed on the ceiling, half expecting it to cave in. That was when the whispers came again, more insistent. It wasn't one voice. It sounded like a chorus of them, each a soft rasp in the walls. They began echoing lines from my manuscript, weaving my words together with new phrases I'd never written. I could barely swallow. My throat felt parched, and a cold sweat trickled down my back. My fingers trembled so violently that I nearly dropped my laptop. I wanted to block my ears, but I knew the voices were already in my head. In a moment of desperate resolve, I typed on my manuscript, "Stop." Immediately, the whispers paused, as if they had been waiting for me to say something. The silence was worse, suffocating and absolute. My reflection in the laptop's dark screen showed wide, bloodshot eyes. I tried to write more, to purge my thoughts onto the page in the hope that I could regain control of the narrative. Yet every sentence I added seemed to provoke an immediate reaction from the apartment. A faint scratching against the walls here, a rattling from the vents there. My own words were fueling the phenomenon. At some point, the overhead light began to flicker more violently than ever. The old bulb buzzed with each flash, intensifying the sense of claustrophobic dread. The shadows jumped around the walls in twisted shapes that seemed to flicker in corners I couldn't quite see. My heart pounded like a drum in my chest, and a stabbing headache crept in behind my eyes. The fear was so overwhelming that I felt nauseated. One particularly ominous night, the pacing on the ceiling stopped abruptly. The hush that followed was more terrifying than the noise itself. My hearing became hypersensitive, and I could make out the sound of my own lungs laboring to suck in air. Then came the knocking, soft but deliberate, just above my bed. My entire body tensed. I stared at the ceiling as though it would reveal eyes looking back at me. When the knocking repeated, I noticed that it fell into the exact rhythm of my heartbeat. It felt like whatever was up there wanted me to know it could sense my fear. The apartment began to feel smaller and smaller, as if the walls were closing in. My mind kept drifting to the scrawled paragraphs in my manuscript, words I hadn't written. I started to wonder if the place itself was trying to write something through me. I had once read about authors who felt possessed by their stories, but this was different. This was intrusion, violation. I rarely slept more than a few hours, and when I did, I had nightmares of the walls speaking in unison. Upon waking, I always discovered new lines added to my manuscript, cryptic sentences about dark hallways and hidden watchers, scrawled in that same jagged handwriting. Whenever I tried to leave, the door refused to open. The windows were old, covered with rusted locks that wouldn't budge no matter how hard I pried at them. I thought about calling for help, but who would hear me through those thick, suffocating walls? My phone's battery drained inexplicably fast, and the few text messages I managed to send were never answered. It was as if the world outside had forgotten I existed. At one point, I recalled hearing faint conversation in the hallway. It was a muffled exchange that sounded like two neighbors discussing the building's flickering power. But by the time I hurried to the door and pounded on it, the voices were gone. Later, I heard the landlord's voice outside complaining about something. His tone was dismissive and irritated, but I couldn't make out the exact words. When I shouted that I was locked in and needed help, there was no response. I slipped a note under the door, hoping maybe it would be found, but it simply reappeared on my coffee table an hour later, as though someone or something had returned it. The note was crumpled and partially torn, my handwriting circled by that same unfamiliar scrawl. I recoiled in horror, feeling as though the apartment was openly mocking me. Days and nights blurred together, each hour more suffocating than the last. I could feel my sanity fraying, like threads unraveling from an old sweater. My sense of time eroded, and I found myself drifting between states of half-consciousness. Sometimes I wasn't sure if I was awake or dreaming. I questioned whether all of this was my own doing, perhaps a mental breakdown triggered by stress, exhaustion, and isolation. Yet the physical evidence of that foreign handwriting on my pages wouldn't let me completely dismiss the supernatural possibility. I tried a final, desperate measure. I took my laptop, opened the manuscript, and deleted every word. It took ages because the trackpad kept glitching and the screen flickered. But eventually, I watched as every line vanished. My heart pounded so fiercely it felt like it might burst from my chest. When I finished, I saved the file, closed the laptop, and lay down on the couch, panting and drenched in sweat. At first, there was silence, excruciating in its anticipation. Then, a slow, deliberate creak sounded from the walls, followed by that faint whispering chorus. It was as if the place was furious, seething in a language just out of my comprehension. I stood up, pressing my ear to the wall, listening to the rustling sounds inside. Then I felt a slight vibration under my palm, a pulsing that matched my racing heartbeat. Without warning, the lights flickered out completely, plunging me into darkness. I groped my way to the door, hoping perhaps it would open in the blackout. Miraculously, the knob turned this time. I stumbled into the hallway, adrenaline coursing through my veins. My legs trembled, and I nearly collapsed from relief. The corridor was dim, lit only by a single flickering emergency bulb at the far end. I forced myself down the hallway, each step heavier than the last. My instincts told me to flee as far as I could, but I had to get to the stairwell. The building groaned as I moved, and the scuttling footsteps returned from above, chasing me with an urgency I could feel in my bones. My breath hitched in my throat, and every nerve screamed at me to run faster. The gloom pressed in from all sides. Finally, I found the door to the staircase and shoved it open. A rush of cold air hit me like a slap. The stairwell was empty, but it didn't feel safe. It felt cavernous, echoing my ragged breathing in a mocking chorus. I moved downward, flight after flight, gripping the handrail so tightly my knuckles ached. I kept expecting the stairs to crumble under me or for some figure to emerge from the shadows. But nothing stopped me. By the time I reached the ground floor and burst out onto the street, my lungs were on fire. I felt dizzy, disoriented, half convinced that I was still trapped in some twisted hallucination. Outside, the night air was brisk, and the sky was clouded over. A few passers-by cast me strange, concerned glances, but none approached. I stumbled a block away before leaning against a street lamp, clutching my chest as I tried to steady my breathing. Only then did it dawn on me that I had escaped. In the following days, I found another place to stay. I told a few people, indirectly, that I'd gone through a severe episode of stress in that old apartment. I avoided giving them any details, partly because I didn't want to relive it, and partly because I feared they would think I was out of my mind. I sometimes caught myself listening for footsteps where there were none, or hearing faint whispers in the hum of air conditioning units. My manuscript remained unwritten. Any attempt to continue it filled me with a creeping dread, as though the text itself was alive. The landlord tried to contact me once, leaving a curt voicemail about finalizing paperwork. I never returned the call. I had no interest in setting foot near that building again. Yet every so often, late at night, I think I hear faint scrawling, like a pen on paper. I wake up expecting to see those foreign words on my own walls, as if the apartment's influence could stretch far beyond its domain. My heart will race, my skin will crawl, and for a terrifying moment, I'll be convinced I'm still there, pinned beneath those malicious footsteps and haunted by voices that echo my every thought. Though I managed to leave, I can't truly say I feel free. The memory of that place lingers like a stain on my psyche, an ever-present question. Was it all in my head? Or did something in that apartment choose me as its conduit? I don't have an answer. I only know that I can't shake the sensation of eyes watching me whenever I'm alone, waiting for the next sentence I dare to write. And in that silence, I sometimes hear a whisper that completes my unfinished thoughts. Story 8. I remember the first time I saw that damn clock. It was the kind of moment that makes your heart clench, as if an invisible hand reached into your chest and squeezed. Even from a distance, it stood out, a tall and ornate relic that demanded attention in the darkness of the dusty workshop. The sight of its tarnished bronze casing and curving hands, both frozen at 3:33, was enough to spark a low-grade panic in me. I tried to brush it off as curiosity, but there was something in the air, an oppressive heaviness that made me swallow hard and glance over my shoulder for no logical reason. I've been a watchmaker for most of my adult life. Precision has always been my comfort zone, a realm where every gear has its place, and every mechanism has a reason. That was before the clock. Back then, I believed in tangible evidence, in solutions to mechanical problems that always came down to missing pieces or worn-out parts. But when I took on the job of restoring this antiquated clock, my sense of reality started to fray. I acquired the piece from a local estate sale, a tip from a friend who thought I might be intrigued by the craftsmanship. He mentioned the original owner had lost interest in it because it never kept proper time. Allegedly, it had been showing 3:33 without fail, never ticking forward or backward. I heard through a third party that the owner's fixation on it was intense. He had begun seeing strange visions, lights flickering, shapes darting at the corners of his eyes. Gradually, he lost track of days and nights, frequently waking in unfamiliar rooms in his own house. They said he gave up the clock to regain his peace of mind. When I first brought it back to my workshop, I chalked up the stories to superstition. I do not scare easily, and I firmly believe that any clock could be fixed with enough time and expertise. My plan was simple: open it, see what was stuck or damaged, and replace or repair the relevant components. But the moment it entered my space, I felt something shift. My overhead light flickered, then went out completely. At first, I assumed a blown bulb and decided I would replace it later. Then my radio hissed with static and shut off. My phone's screen froze. Every piece of electronics I relied on began to malfunction. In a single blink, my workshop turned into a cave of shadows, illuminated only by the faint gray light filtering in from the window. I noticed that all these malfunctions seemed to radiate from the clock. The closer I got to it, the weaker my devices became. My phone's battery icon dropped rapidly until it died, despite having been fully charged. I tried turning the overhead light on again, but the switch wouldn't respond. That's when I started hearing it. The soft click, click, click of a ticking sound, but not coming from the clock's face. It seemed to echo from the walls, as if some phantom gear was lodged between layers of plaster and wood. It grew louder whenever I leaned over the clock to inspect it. My first night with the clock was a restless one. I took it home, intending to examine it in a more comfortable environment. My workshop is small, and without proper lighting, I figured it would be better to work in my home office. As soon as I set the clock down on my desk, my computer screen sputtered and died. The lamp next to me dimmed to a weak glow and then faded out, leaving me in near darkness. Outside, streetlights blinked off and on, in an erratic pattern that made me feel dizzy. My heartbeat sounded too loud in my ears, and I realized I was trembling slightly. The clock, however, remained inert, showing its eternal 3:33, almost daring me to question my own senses. I tried to calm myself by going through my usual process. Unscrew the back panel, check the gears, look for rust or misalignment. Yet inside, everything appeared pristine. The cogs were made of an unfamiliar metal, something that seemed more matte than the usual brass. The internal components almost hummed, though not in a way I could easily identify. It was like feeling a vibration you couldn't quite trace, a subtle but relentless pulse that resonated beneath your skin. Each time I moved my hands closer, the hair on my arms stood on end, and I got lightheaded, as if the air was pulled from the room. That night, I barely slept. When I finally drifted off, I dreamed of corridor after corridor lined with clocks, all stuck at 3:33. Some were tiny wristwatches, some were grand pendulum clocks taller than me. They all ticked at an identical rhythm, tick-tock, tick-tock, each beat accompanied by that same draining sensation, as if every clock was siphoning away something vital. At some point, I jolted awake, drenched in sweat, with a hoarse breath catching in my throat. My heart pounded, and for a second, I swore I could hear ticking within the walls of my bedroom. In the days that followed, my state of mind deteriorated. I found myself losing track of time and place. I would start working on a different project, only to blink and discover an hour had passed without any recollection of what I'd been doing. Once, I startled myself by realizing I was standing in the basement, with no memory of walking down there. My clothes felt damp with perspiration, my palms clammy. Each time I tried to piece it together, my head would throb, and I'd feel a subtle vibration emanating from somewhere in the house, always near the walls. I called a colleague, hoping to discuss the repairs for this strange clock. Over the phone, he said he'd heard rumors the piece was cursed, that the original owner claimed it fed on electricity and even on human energy. According to him, the man had tried everything to rid himself of the persistent visions that the clock brought about, going so far as to store it in a lead-lined box. I listened intently, my pulse drumming in my ears. I asked my friend to elaborate, but the call abruptly cut off. The phone screen went black. In that silent moment, I felt more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. Every attempt I made at stepping away from the clock was thwarted by an inexplicable pull. I'd leave it in the corner of the room, telling myself I'd ignore it for a while, maybe even discard it. But then I'd feel compelled to check if the time had changed. It never did. Still 3:33, unwavering. Once I carried it out to my trash bin, hoping to get rid of it once and for all. As I set the clock down, the entire block's power surged. The streetlights popped, throwing sparks. My neighbor's windows all went dark for a full minute, and the temperature around me felt like it dropped by several degrees. A violent shiver coursed through my spine. Something about that blackout moment felt like a threat, a silent warning that discarding the clock wouldn't be so simple. The ticking in the walls became more frequent. At times, I questioned my sanity. I began searching for actual pests, thinking maybe there were rats or insects behind the drywall, but I found nothing. The sound wasn't scuttling or scratching. It was methodical, measured. A tick followed by a tock, steady and precise. Occasionally, it seemed to speed up to match my quickened heartbeat. My breathing grew ragged whenever I heard it, and I noticed my fingers trembling uncontrollably. Even the simplest daily tasks, drinking water, washing my face, felt nerve-wracking. My senses were on constant high alert. Then the visions started. Shadows shifting in my peripheral vision. Blurry figures occupying corners of the room when I turned the lights on. At one point, I could have sworn I saw my own reflection in a mirror, only it wasn't following my movements. My reflection's eyes looked a fraction too large, as though searching for something beyond the glass. My stomach twisted, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. I stopped looking in mirrors after that. Soon, I began to lose track of my own identity. I'd wake up in the living room at odd hours, with no memory of how I got there. My clothes felt stiff, as though I'd been wearing them for days. The gloom in the house felt stifling, as if the walls were closing in. I tried to recall my last conversation with a friend or a family member, but the details became fuzzy. My sense of self unraveled more each day, replaced by a feeling that something else was guiding my actions. The nightmares grew more frequent and intense, always centering around that unchanging time, 3:33. I found an old journal tucked away inside the clock's interior compartment, hidden behind a false panel. Although much of it was illegible, I deciphered enough to realize it belonged to the original owner, the one who had parted with the clock. The pages spoke of sleepless nights and bizarre electrical failures. He wrote about hearing ticking sounds emanating from beneath the floorboards and behind the wallpaper, about the unsettling sense that the clock was watching him with its unmoving hands. He spoke of losing himself, waking in places without recollection. I see my own face looking back at me in the dark. One line read, "But it's not me." His words echoed my own experiences so closely that my breath caught in my throat. My heart pounded so violently I worried it might give out. The journal's final entry mentioned a revelation. He believed the clock was a conduit to something that thrived on energy, both electrical and human. He wrote that its power peaked at 3:33, a time that was neither fully night nor fully day, a liminal space where reality blurred. In the following days, the tension in my home became nearly unbearable. Lights refused to work, or if they did, they cast a weak, flickering glow that danced menacingly across every surface. My phone was rendered useless, batteries drained the moment I tried to charge them. I sensed eyes on me from every angle, felt pricks of sensation on the back of my neck as though something hovered just out of sight. The ticking grew louder, and sometimes it overlapped with the pounding of my heart, creating a suffocating rhythm that left me gasping for breath. I stopped eating and lost weight, my cheeks becoming hollow. My reflection, if I ever caught a glimpse of it, looked gaunt and haunted, with dark circles under wide, restless eyes. One evening, I collapsed onto my couch, utterly exhausted. My chest felt tight, as though a band was constricting my lungs, and my throat was parched. I realized I hadn't had a sip of water in hours. In the silence, broken only by the distant hum of the clock, I started to drift off. Then came that ticking in the walls, louder and faster, as if beckoning me. In that moment, I knew I had to confront the clock once and for all. I lugged the piece to my basement, stumbling down the steps in near darkness. Every muscle in my body felt weak, and my head spun. I set it on my workbench, ignoring the dizziness that threatened to knock me over. I could sense it drawing power from every flickering bulb and from my own trembling hands. Opening it again, I faced the internal mechanism that defied logic. I felt an almost electrical jolt course up my arms as I touched the cogs. The entire basement flickered in and out of darkness. My knees buckled, but I forced myself to remain upright. In my mind, I repeated a mantra, insisting that I was in control. I was the watchmaker, the one who understood how gears aligned, how clockwork followed laws of motion. I refused to be undone by some archaic relic. I reached for a small hammer, intending to break the internal components. The moment the hammer's metal head made contact, a surge of energy burst outward. It felt like a gale-force wind roaring through my basement. The walls groaned, and the overhead bulb erupted in a shower of sparks. I shut my eyes, bracing for the worst, my heart thundering so loud I could almost taste the adrenaline on my tongue. When I opened my eyes again, I was lying on the basement floor, panting, my limbs heavy with fatigue. A faint glow from the single intact light bulb revealed the clock on the workbench, cracked open and silent at last. Its once vibrant hum was gone. My first instinct was to crawl over to it, half expecting it to unleash another bolt of energy. But it lay there, its components shattered and powerless. The time still read 3:33, frozen forever, but I no longer felt the malignant pulse coming from within. I slowly climbed to my feet, drenched in cold sweat. The basement was eerily quiet. No ticking in the walls, no buzzing overhead. My breath was ragged, and my heartbeat echoed in my ears. But for the first time in weeks, I felt the oppressive weight lift just a little. Cautiously, I made my way upstairs. My phone on the table flickered back to life. The lights in the house glowed steadily. Despite the relief, an underlying terror remained, coiled at the base of my spine. The experience had left a mark, a lingering sense that I had brushed against something I couldn't fully understand. Even now, I can't be certain I vanquished whatever haunted that clock. Sometimes, late at night, I think I hear a faint click, click, click echoing in the distance, but it could be my mind playing tricks on me. I've stowed the broken clock in a sealed crate in the far corner of my workshop, refusing to revisit it. Yet I'm still afraid. Afraid that I'm only a breath away from waking up somewhere unfamiliar with no memory of how I got there. Afraid that, deep inside, something of that clock remains in me, in my home, in my pulse. And every so often, my watch will lose a minute, skipping straight to 3:33 for no apparent reason. When it does, I feel my heart race and my skin prickle with goosebumps, as though the clock is reminding me it's never truly gone. I survived, and I remain in my own house, forging ahead one day at a time. But I can't shake the sense that something changed in me the moment I let that relic into my life. My nights are still plagued by odd dreams and fleeting visions in the corners of my eyes. The boundary between reality and nightmare feels thinner now, more fragile, and I find myself checking the time obsessively, dreading the split second when the numbers on any given device might flicker and settle on 3:33. Because in that breathless moment I sense all too clearly that the clock's influence is not just metal and gears. It's something intangible, lurking at the edges of perception, feeding on every flicker of fear, and it's only waiting for the right moment to tick again. Story 9. I first felt the chill in the hallway, the kind of cold that seeps into your marrow and makes your teeth clatter in the silence. Before I even realized the mansion's lights were too dim, I sensed something watching me from the corners. The very walls seemed to breathe, whispering an unspoken warning every time I passed the ancient portraits. My heart hammered in my chest with a jittery intensity, and I caught a faint scent of stagnant water in the air that made my stomach twist in unease. I tried to shake off that initial impression, reminding myself I had been hired as the caretaker here for a reason. No one else wanted the job, and I couldn't afford to be picky. I arrived at the estate one evening as an early spring rain dripped ominously from the bare branches outside. The old manor loomed 3 stories high, its windows lifeless and dark, save for the single yellow glow of the foyer lamp. My instructions were straightforward: maintain the grounds, monitor the security cameras, and ensure the place remained in pristine condition for the owner's return during the summer. A routine job, I told myself, stepping into the cavernous entrance hall with my small suitcase in hand. The hush inside felt like a living creature that pressed against my eardrums, making me aware of my own heartbeat throbbing in my temples. At that moment, I had no inkling of the bizarre events that would unfold. All I knew was that I needed to earn my pay, and that for better or worse, this was my new home. On my first night, after unpacking my sparse belongings, I went through the house, methodically checking every room to familiarize myself with the layout. The mansion was a maze of corridors, each leading to a different sort of gloom. There was a grand dining hall filled with dusty candelabras, a library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, and a smaller parlor that held several oil paintings of faces I couldn't quite name but felt were following me with their eyes. My bedroom was on the 2nd floor, overlooking the expansive grounds and the black waters of the lake beyond. A single bed, a wooden dresser, and a nightstand with a crooked lamp made up its sparse furnishings. Outside, the thunder murmured, and wind scratched at the window like skeletal fingertips. I slipped under the covers, trying to ignore the dull pounding in my chest, that primal sense that something was not right. I woke the following morning feeling inexplicably groggy, as though I had barely slept. My throat felt parched, and the taste in my mouth was metallic, making me grimace when I tried to swallow. The first thing I noticed was an odd smell in the room, thick and wet, like a swamp left too long in the sun. My sheets, to my shock, were damp and greenish in places. Slimy patches of algae clung to the fabric. Instantly, my heart jerked in my chest, and I scrambled out of bed, the floor cold against my bare feet. There was no direct explanation for the presence of algae or why the air reeked of stagnant water. I marched around the room, opening the window to let in fresh air, gagging at the pungent odor. I wondered if I might have dragged something inside by mistake the previous day, but I couldn't recall going anywhere near the lake. That same day, after I cleaned up my bed and disposed of the damp sheets, I decided to check the security cameras. The mansion was equipped with an old but functional surveillance system that recorded in black and white. I found the tape from the night before and fast-forwarded through hours of uneventful footage. Empty corridors, quiet rooms, static flickers. Around 3 in the morning, the camera pointed at the entrance hall showed what looked like a faint outline of a figure. It appeared to ripple, as though made of water, drifting slowly from the front door to the staircase. My breath hitched. I backed up the footage and played it again, leaning in so close to the monitor that my forehead almost touched the screen. The figure was shapeless at first, then formed into a vaguely human silhouette before dissolving into a haze of static near the stairs. My stomach churned with dread. I told myself it might have been a glitch in the system, moisture in the lenses, or some reflection from outside. Still, every time I blinked, I pictured that watery shape gliding through the corridors. My pulse quickened to a drumbeat against my ribs, and for the rest of the day, I went about my tasks, dusting the library shelves, sweeping leaves off the patio, while occasionally pausing to see if something lingered in my peripheral vision. The estate seemed quiet, but with a hush that felt anticipatory, as though waiting for the next disquieting moment. That evening, I bathed in the mansion's large 2nd-floor bathroom. Steam rose around me, and I tried to relax, letting the hot water soothe my frazzled nerves. When I turned off the shower, I noticed something scrawled across the mirror through the fog. 3 words etched into the condensation. "Do not stay." My throat clenched and I reeled backward so violently that I almost tripped on the bath mat. The letters were large, dripping with water that trickled down the glass as if alive. My breathing became ragged and I felt the frantic pounding of my pulse in my neck. There was no question in my mind that I had not written it. Yet I stood there in shock, trying to rationalize. Perhaps the previous occupant had drawn something on the mirror, and the steam revealed it anew. But it looked fresh, as if a fingertip had just carved those letters moments ago. I wiped the mirror clean and pretended it was some leftover scribble. Maybe a trick of condensation. Still, I slept fitfully that night, my heart racing every time I heard the faint creak of floorboards in the hallway. Around midnight, I was half awake when I heard a soft dripping sound, like someone stepping with wet feet right outside my bedroom door. My muscles froze, every inch of me tensed under the covers. The dripping seemed to move, heading down the corridor, then faded away. The next morning, I found wet footprints leading from the direction of the lake up to the back entrance, across the marble floor, and straight to the corridor outside my bedroom. I felt blood surge in my ears as I followed them, my pulse thrumming out a rapid, nervous beat. The footprints vanished by the time they reached the far end of the hallway, as though whatever created them had simply evaporated. Realizing that ignoring this was impossible, I checked every lock and window. Nothing was forced, no sign of a break-in. My mind started to wander to darker possibilities. Had I tracked them in my sleep? Was I sleepwalking down to the lake? I began second-guessing myself, replaying every step I'd taken since moving into the mansion. That sense of being watched intensified. Shadows in corners took on menacing shapes whenever I turned my head too quickly. At times, I was sure I caught a glimpse of a watery reflection slithering past the threshold of a room. My throat was perpetually dry, and my palms constantly sweaty. I was torn between wanting to confront whatever was lurking and wanting to barricade myself in my bedroom and pretend none of this was real. On the third night, I forced myself to check the cameras again. My hands trembled as I pressed play. At precisely 2:45 in the morning, the camera in the main corridor showed that nebulous figure materializing out of thin air, water dripping in slow trickles from its outline. It moved with a listless but purposeful glide, as if searching for something. It paused outside my room, standing unnaturally still, and faced the door. My body tensed, just watching the footage. I could almost feel its gaze penetrating the wood and creeping over me while I slept. Then, as suddenly as it arrived, it turned and vanished off camera toward the stairs. I spent the rest of that day in a haze of fear, jumping at every minor sound. The old pipes clanked and groaned, the wind howled through cracks in the window frames, and somewhere in the house, a slow drip echoed like a tiny heartbeat. Late in the afternoon, I went out to the lake for the first time, compelled by a macabre curiosity. The water was dark, covered with patches of algae. The surface looked almost oily, reflecting a distorted mirror image of the mansion. An oppressive quiet clung to the water's edge. Kneeling beside it, I noticed footprints, similar in size to mine, leading in and out of the murk. My hands shook, and my breath caught in my chest at the realization that I might have been out there at night, or worse, that something else was crossing between the lake and the mansion. I couldn't let the confusion fester any longer. I placed a call to the estate's owner, hoping for some explanation. Over the phone, his tone sounded uncomfortable when I described the strange occurrences. He told me, indirectly, about local rumors of an old tragedy involving the lake, although he avoided any direct details. His few words offered no comfort, only reinforcing my sense of isolation. When I asked what I should do, he simply suggested remaining diligent and keeping the place secure. His hesitation implied he might know more than he was willing to share. That night, the tension in the house reached a suffocating peak. My breath felt heavy, and my lungs ached as I gasped for air. Every hallway seemed darker than before, the overhead bulbs flickering as though struggling to stay lit. My heart thudded relentlessly, and sweat broke out along my forehead. I decided I could no longer sleep in that bedroom, so I tried resting in a small sitting room instead, one with fewer windows and a single door that I could lock. The stench of swamp water clung to my clothes, even though I had showered twice, scrubbing until my skin turned raw. My nerves were so frayed that every rustle of wind against the mansion's eaves made me jolt, as if an intruder had burst in. At around 1 in the morning, I snapped fully awake to a new sound, a slow scraping against the door, like damp fingers trailing across the wood. It was rhythmic, almost patient. My blood turned to ice in my veins. The scraping stopped for a moment, replaced by silence. Then, from somewhere behind the walls, I heard the muffled drip of water. I felt a sudden surge of claustrophobia. Every nerve screamed at me to run, to flee the estate right then. But I also felt a perverse need to face whatever had invaded my sanctuary. So, I edged toward the door, my skin crawling with goosebumps, my breath uneven. The handle felt cold and slick. When I swung the door open, the corridor was empty. Yet there were puddles on the floor, leading off toward the main staircase. Shaking and dizzy with fear, I followed those puddles. They trailed across the landing and descended the stairs. My entire body felt rigid, as though my muscles no longer responded naturally, only moving out of sheer compulsion. I flicked on the flashlight I kept in my pocket, the beam unsteady because of my trembling hand. Down the corridor, I noticed the front doors were wide open, moonlight illuminating a track of wet footprints heading outside. I stood in the threshold of the mansion's entrance, heart jackhammering. Outside, the lawn shimmered under the moon, and the path of footprints continued straight to the lake. With my throat tight, I stepped out onto the wet grass. The smell of rotten water smacked my senses, making me gag. I forced myself forward, each step feeling heavier, as if something wanted me to abandon the search and cower indoors. By the time I reached the lake's edge, my teeth were chattering, not from cold, but from raw terror. The footprints disappeared into the inky blackness of the water. My flashlight beam revealed tiny ripples, as though something had just slipped below the surface. I crouched down, shining the light into the water. For a heartbeat, I saw my own reflection, drawn, pale, eyes wild with panic. Then, behind my mirrored image, I saw another face, ghostly and shifting, like a half-formed visage in the depths. It was gone in a blink, replaced by my reflection alone. My knees nearly buckled as a wave of nausea washed over me. I couldn't remain here, not with that presence lurking just out of sight. I backed away, stumbling on the slick grass, panting heavily. Back inside the house, I slammed and locked the doors, though I knew locks were meaningless if the entity could simply manifest. The rest of the night was a blur of adrenaline, my heart refusing to slow to a normal rhythm. I waited for dawn, pacing in the foyer with sweat trickling down my neck. Whenever I paused, I heard faint gurgling sounds, like the echo of water swirling in distant pipes. My limbs trembled, and my throat felt as if it had sandpaper in it. The smell of stagnant water seemed to cling to every corridor. At first light, I made my decision. I could not stay in that mansion another night. I gathered my scant belongings, every muscle in my body still tense and on edge. My breath was shallow, and I couldn't shake the dizzying sense of being watched. As I left my room for the final time, I caught sight of the bathroom mirror. Condensation from the morning's humidity had formed again, revealing a new message scrawled in dripping letters. Never leave the water. A suffocating dread seized my chest. I forced my feet to move. Without hesitation, I hurried down the main staircase, refusing to glance at the corners or the windows, afraid of seeing that shifting, watery form one last time. The door groaned as I pushed it open, letting in a surge of fresh air that couldn't dispel the foul stench clinging to my clothes. I rushed outside, half expecting to see footsteps behind me, but the lawn looked as undisturbed as a graveyard. I flung my bags into my car and started the engine, my hands shaking so violently that I struggled to keep a grip on the wheel. As I drove away from the estate, I felt an inexplicable pressure in my ears, like the hush before a storm. My throat hurt, and I realized my mouth had gone impossibly dry. Every mile between me and that lake felt like a weight lifting from my shoulders. Yet an unsettling worry gnawed at me, one that tightened my chest and made my pulse hammer away. Even in my rearview mirror, I could almost imagine a ripple in the air, a distortion following me. The memory of the messages on the mirror, the slow drip of water in the corridors, and the algae in my bed clung to me like a slick film. Although I escaped those walls, the sense of something trailing me from the black water lingers. My paranoia remains long after I've left, and whenever I close my eyes, I see that face behind my reflection. The smell of stagnant water never fully washes away, and I find myself waking from nightmares soaked in sweat, convinced that wet footprints are outside my door once again. Even now, I'm not entirely sure what I experienced in that mansion. Perhaps I was simply teetering on the edge of my own sanity, and the silent corridors awakened a hidden fear in me. Or maybe something truly unnatural crawled up from the lake, searching for a home beyond the water's boundary. Whatever the truth, I can't forget the wet footprints and the scrawled warnings, words that implied I had stumbled into something older and more malevolent than I could comprehend. Every time I catch a glimpse of myself in a mirror, I wait for a nebulous shape to appear behind me, silently reminding me of that final message. We can try to leave, but sometimes the darkest parts of a place follow us, lurking like a shadow in still waters, waiting for the moment when our guard slips, our breath stutters, and our hearts pound with the realization that we have only just begun to see the horror that lies beneath the surface. Story 10. I still remember the first time I saw the chair. It was an unassuming piece of furniture with a high wooden back and worn armrests, but there was something vaguely unsettling about it. The dull finish seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and a faint smell of dust and something else, something acrid, hung in the air around it. Even the moment I placed my hand on the backrest, I felt an inexplicable chill run through my entire body, as if an invisible current had passed from the chair into my spine. That was my first warning, though I didn't realize it at the time. Perhaps I should have listened to my instincts and sent the chair away immediately. But I inherited it from an elderly great-uncle, someone I barely knew who had stated in his final legal documents that this piece was meant for me. There was no mention of a bequest of money or property, just this single, peculiar chair. I'm a journalist. Well, I was fully focused on my investigative reporting before all this began. My life had never been glamorous, but it was stable. I spent my days digging into local news stories, writing articles on community events, and occasionally uncovering small-town scandals. The mundane realities of interviewing city council members and rummaging through public records felt routine and safe. At night, if I worked late, my office would be quiet, illuminated only by a flickering desk lamp. I never used to mind the hush of solitude. It gave me space to think. But after the chair arrived, solitude turned into something suffocating. When the delivery service dropped it off, they placed it in my cramped office, right next to my writing desk. I thought about stashing it in the attic or maybe donating it somewhere. Yet, for some reason, I felt compelled to keep it near my workspace. Part of me rationalized that I might use it as an interesting prop for interviews at home. Another part felt a strange magnetism, as if the chair were silently insisting that I not banish it to some dusty corner. My first night working with the chair in the room, I caught myself glancing at it every few minutes. It just sat there unmoving, but I couldn't shake the impression that it was observing me. If I pressed my ear close enough, I swear I heard a faint creaking sound, like wood expanding in the heat. Except it was cold that night. The hair on my arms would rise for no apparent reason. A few days later, I had my first lapse. It was a Tuesday. I remember waking up at my desk, my fingers still clutching a pen, notes spread out around me in a chaotic sprawl. At first I assumed I'd simply dozed off, the victim of a too long night of research. Then I noticed that the pages in front of me were filled with words I didn't recall writing. The penmanship looked like mine, but the content was disturbing. Every sentence described grim scenarios involving crimes of violence, detailed in a way that made my heart pound. There was an uncanny familiarity in the style. It was as though my investigative instincts had fueled a piece of speculative writing, but so much darker and more vivid than any story I'd ever produced. I tried to brush it off. I told myself I must have had a nightmare, and unconsciously scribbled down bizarre ideas. Journalists experience stress and occasionally dream about their stories, right? Except these details were too specific, involving people I had never even heard of. It listed the times, locations, and methods of potential attacks. Nothing indicated a fatal outcome, but the viciousness implied sent a chill down my spine. I locked the pages in a drawer, telling myself I'd figure it out later. When I looked over at the chair, it seemed to loom larger than before, like it had somehow advanced toward me even though it hadn't moved an inch. From then on, the incidents escalated. Some nights, I'd stand to stretch, intending to grab a coffee, and my eyes would drift to the chair. Without realizing it, I'd sit down in it instead, and then I'd lose track of time. I'd snap back to consciousness hours later, ink staining my fingertips, more pages spread out before me. Sometimes I'd find them pinned to the walls, as though I'd been analyzing a case. The more I read, the more nauseated I became. They detailed uncommitted crimes with a relentless grimness: battery, break-ins, kidnappings that never named minors but still horrifying in their potential cruelty. Each time I told myself these were just fantasies, perhaps the product of an overstressed mind. The sense of shame and confusion gnawed at me, and I shuddered whenever I remembered how my hands would feel stiff and achy afterward, like they'd been clenched around a pen for hours. Eventually, I tried to get rid of the chair. I contacted a local junk removal service and they hauled it away, looking puzzled as to why I was discarding a perfectly sturdy antique. That same evening, as I returned home, I entered my office to find the chair placed neatly beside my desk again. The seat felt warm, as if someone had just been sitting in it. My pulse jackhammered in my chest. My breathing went shallow and my skin broke out in goosebumps. I swore there was a faint indentation in the cushion, though the material should have sprung back instantly. Every nerve in my body roared with alarm, and I remember dropping my keys to the floor as I stood there, heart pounding so violently that a rush of blood surged to my temples. I double-checked the door locks, the windows. Everything was secure. I had personally left the chair in the pickup truck hours before, and yet, there it was, defying reason. Over the next few weeks, I repeated this process of disposal more than once. I would pay a neighbor to haul it, or I'd drive out to the edge of town and leave it on the curb. No matter what I did, the chair would always be back in my office by the time I returned. The presence of it unhinged me. I slept fitfully, plagued by nightmares of scribbling in a frantic, possessed state. On nights when I fought that overwhelming urge to sit in the chair, I could almost hear the wood scraping against the floor, beckoning me with a subtle push. I grew paranoid. I asked a colleague, an old friend who used to share a newsroom with me, if she had any ideas about cursed objects or hallucinations triggered by chronic stress. She seemed concerned for my well-being and suggested that I might need a break or possibly professional help. She spoke softly about therapy and medication, never implying that I was losing my mind, but the undercurrent of her words felt patronizing. I declined her suggestions as politely as I could, though inside I trembled with uncertainty. Was I losing my grip on reality? My home and office became oppressive. The lighting felt perpetually dim, even on sunny days, as though shadows clung to every corner. Sometimes, I caught flickers of movement in my peripheral vision, a dark shape passing quickly near a wall, or a glint at the edge of my desk that vanished the instant I looked straight at it. My heart would race, pounding in my ears. The dryness in my mouth made it difficult to swallow. My clothes would stick to my clammy skin, and I'd feel the inexplicable urge to run out of the house just to breathe. But the moment I stepped away, a force seemed to pull me back, compelling me to return to that cursed chair. One afternoon, I tried to distance myself by visiting a local library to research any historical background on the antique. My fingers trembled as I scanned microfilm archives, hoping to find a snippet of information about my great-uncle or about furniture with a reputation. I found scattered references to unexplained occurrences in a house my relative once owned. Neighbors had whispered about strange lights late at night, repeated sightings of visitors who arrived silently and departed in the early morning. Some rumored that local law enforcement had been called on multiple occasions to investigate suspicious activity, but no official record corroborated that claim. I left the library shaking, feeling no closer to an answer. My head pounded with every step back to my car, adrenaline leaving my limbs weak and uncooperative. I started noticing changes in my behavior outside the office. My normally patient demeanor warped into irritability. If I overheard a conversation about local incidents of vandalism or burglary, my stomach twisted in an uncomfortable mixture of fear and fascination. I'd feel an urge to ask for more details, as if drawn to the possibility that one of those crimes resembled what I'd written in my involuntary sessions. The worst part was that I began slipping into these blackouts not just at night, but during the day as well. I'd blink, and suddenly time would have jumped forward by hours. I'd find new pages detailing other monstrous acts, names I didn't recognize, and addresses in parts of town I had never visited. I tried leaving a recording device on my desk to capture whatever happened when I blacked out. On one of the recordings, I heard the sound of the chair creaking, followed by slow, measured writing, pen scratching paper in a steady rhythm. Every so often, there was a strange sigh, almost like a low moan, echoing through the room. It didn't sound like me. It was more guttural, pained, and thick with unspoken menace. When I listened closely, I heard my own voice muttering phrases under its breath, narrating horrific acts in a cold, detached way. The revelation made my throat tighten in sheer panic. It felt as though a cold weight settled on my chest, making each breath a struggle. At one point, I tried speaking with a local historian. He admitted he'd heard rumors of a cursed heirloom circulating within certain families in the region, something about a piece of furniture that compelled its owner to record the unspeakable. However, he refused to elaborate further. He looked away, shifting uncomfortably in his chair, and just mentioned that some doors, once opened, are better left alone. His abrupt dismissal left me both frustrated and terrified. It was the closest I had come to someone acknowledging that this might be more than just psychological torment. My physical health deteriorated. My hands began to shake at random intervals, even when I wasn't holding a pen. My appetite vanished, replaced by a gnawing anxiety that churned in my stomach like acid. Sleep was impossible without medication. My dreams, when they came, were feverish kaleidoscopes of looming shapes and frantic scribbles across blank sheets of paper. I'd wake drenched in sweat, my muscles clenched as though I had been bracing for a disaster in my sleep. The next time I tried to discard the chair, I drove out to a remote stretch of road. I hurled it onto a pile of splintered debris and watched the battered wood reflect the headlights of my car. I left in a rush, my whole body tingling with a mixture of triumph and dread, convinced that maybe this time it would be gone for good. When I got back home, I forced myself to sit at my desk on a flimsy metal stool I'd borrowed from the garage, hoping to prove my independence from that cursed seat. My heart fluttered uncontrollably as I switched on the desk lamp. For 2 hours, nothing abnormal happened. I felt a cautious surge of optimism, thinking that maybe the chair was gone at last. Then I heard a faint scraping noise in the hallway, like the legs of furniture dragging across hardwood. The sound made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. My vision blurred with the force of my terror. I stepped into the hallway and found the chair leaning against the wall, its seat angled toward me. The entire corridor smelled of ozone, that electric tang in the air, as though a thunderstorm was about to rage indoors. My pulse hammered in my ears, my mouth went bone dry, and I could almost taste metal on my tongue. I tried to scream, but the only sound that emerged was a hoarse exhalation. In that moment, I came to a disturbing realization. The chair wasn't just haunting me, it was merging with some part of me. My blackouts became more frequent, and I developed an uncanny knowledge of events in town that hadn't even occurred yet. I found myself predicting break-ins or violent confrontations days before they happened, details eerily close to the ones scrawled in those grim pages. Yet no one died. There was always some abrupt end to the incident that left people shaken but alive. It was as though the chair was feeding me knowledge of something best left unknown, compelling me to piece it together in the darkest corner of my mind. Unable to stand the oppression anymore, I decided on a final act of defiance. I barricaded myself in the office with a sledgehammer. My plan was straightforward: destroy the chair completely. I breathed in shaky gulps of air, sweat dripping down my forehead as I advanced. My heart pounded so hard that the sound of each beat echoed behind my ears. For a moment I hesitated, my palms slick with perspiration. I felt a nauseating pull, like the chair was beckoning me to sit, to write. A wave of dizziness almost overtook me. Then I gathered what remained of my willpower and swung the sledgehammer with all my might. The wood cracked with a sickening crunch, splintering into ragged shards. I continued pounding until the seat was unrecognizable. The legs snapped in half. Every thud felt like a hollow victory, my arms shaking violently from the force. Exhausted, I sagged to the floor, staring at the pile of wood fragments and twisted nails, my breathing loud and ragged in the silent room. Something about the destruction left an electrical taste in the air. I felt a sudden rush of relief, as if the suffocating presence had finally lifted. For the first time in weeks, I realized my thoughts were my own. My hands no longer trembled, my vision was clear, and an unexpected sense of calm washed over me. I hauled the ruins out piece by piece, discarding them in different trash bins around the neighborhood, determined that they'd never be put back together. The following week was the first time in months that I slept without hearing that insidious creaking or feeling that compulsion to write. My mind still raced with lingering paranoia. I jumped at small sounds in the night, and a flickering overhead light was enough to make my heart pick up speed. But there was hope. I even returned to my journalistic pursuits, albeit cautiously, always half expecting another slip into a blackout. It never came. In the end, I moved my desk into a new room, repainted the walls, and brought in brighter lamps. There are still nights when I recall how it felt to lose control, when my own hands moved against my will. Sometimes I wake up with my heart hammering, certain I've heard the scrape of wood on the floor or glimpsed a dark shape in the corner, but I remind myself that I took a sledgehammer to that chair, that it can't come back. I like to believe I'm free. Yet a subtle dread remains, a quiet but insistent voice in my head, whispering that true evil rarely disappears so easily. It bides its time, finds new vessels, new means. And though I haven't blacked out since, I can't help feeling that someday I might awaken to find a familiar shape waiting in the corner of my office. Even now, my heartbeat quickens at the mere thought. I don't know if the curse is truly broken, or if it's just lying dormant, waiting for me to let down my guard. That gnawing uncertainty is its own special torment, a shadow that clings to me wherever I go. And so I keep the lights on, triple-check the locks, and push myself to stay grounded in reality. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that no matter how much we strive to explain the world through reason and logic, there are cracks, small fissures that darkness seeps through. If you ever come across an old chair with a presence you can't explain, do what I couldn't do soon enough. Run, throw it away, burn it, whatever it takes, because once it has a hold on you, shaking it off might demand a piece of your sanity you'll never fully reclaim. Story 11. I first noticed something was wrong the evening I hauled that tarnished mirror up to my apartment. It was supposed to be the centerpiece of my new design project, an antique accent piece that would ground the rest of the decor. I had found it at a small estate sale, half buried beneath moth-eaten drapes and dusty lamps. Even then, it felt out of place, as though the air around it were colder and denser than in the rest of the house. At the time, I wrote off my unease to being overstressed from work. But as soon as I propped it against the wall, my heart thudded in my chest, and a faint ache settled behind my eyes. The reflection it cast was murky, making my living room seem darker than it was. A crawling sense of dread crept over my skin. I shrugged it off and convinced myself it was just the dirty glass. After all, the silver backing on antique mirrors often corrodes with age. I tried cleaning it, but no matter how hard I wiped, the glass refused to brighten completely. It always maintained a dull sheen, as if it were swallowing the light around it. Something about that disturbed me far more than I cared to admit. Yet, because my design concept demanded a dramatic, vintage piece, I let the mirror stay. That was my first mistake. At night, even with the lights off, the mirror seemed to absorb what little illumination there was. If the glow of the street lamp outside filtered through the window, the mirror's surface reflected an indistinct silhouette. I would stare at it for longer than I should have, trying to identify shapes in the gloom. Something twisted in the pit of my stomach during these silent vigils. I felt as if the mirror was staring back. Some days later, I woke up groggy and disoriented. I could have sworn that I heard a soft shuffling sound in the living room. My skin prickled. I lay still in bed, listening for any other noises, but everything was quiet. My heart was hammering, and I noticed a sheen of sweat had broken out across my forehead. I almost told myself it was a dream. Then, as I rose and caught a glimpse of myself in the bedroom mirror, my normal, functional mirror, I noticed two faint lines on my shoulder that looked like creases. They were red, as if pressed into the skin by fabric. I found that odd, but assumed I had slept on a wrinkled sheet. Shrugging, I brushed it off. It wasn't until later that morning, after I'd made coffee and settled into my couch, that I saw my reflection in the antique mirror. I couldn't put my finger on it immediately, but something was off. My reflection seemed delayed. When I tilted my head to sip my coffee, the mirrored version was just a fraction of a second behind. At first, I thought it was my imagination or some optical quirk of the aged glass. I even waved an arm experimentally, chuckling nervously as my reflection followed, just a breath slower than it should have. I tried to remain calm, telling myself that old mirrors sometimes had imperfections in the glass, causing strange visual effects. Still, I couldn't quell the flutter of fear in my chest. Over the following week, those slight delays became more pronounced. Each day my reflection would lag behind a bit more. My breathing would grow shallow whenever I passed by, and if I lingered too long, I would feel a tingling sensation along my arms and the back of my neck, as though something unseen was brushing against my skin. One night, when I stood in front of the mirror for a final glance before bed, I realized my reflection was smiling faintly, even though my own lips were flat. My stomach turned to ice, and a tremor shot through my body. I blinked rapidly and rubbed my eyes, certain it was a trick of the light, but that disturbing grin remained for a fleeting moment before snapping back to a neutral expression. I tried to ignore it, but ignoring it didn't stop the nightmares. Every morning, I would wake up gasping, with my heart pounding so hard that I could hear the rush of blood in my ears. In my dreams, I would see myself in that mirror, but with features distorted, eyes darker than shadow, skin nearly translucent. That reflection would beckon me to come closer. My heart raced just remembering it, my mouth dry and my skin clammy. Around that time, my work started to suffer. Design requires creativity, but my thoughts were consumed with anxiety. My boss commented that I looked pale and uneasy. I mentioned I was under the weather, leaving out any talk of the mirror. I didn't want to sound unhinged. Besides, I still wasn't entirely sure if there was a rational explanation. Maybe I was exhausted, seeing things because I was stressed and not sleeping well. Occasionally, I would tell my reflections in other mirrors to get a grip, as if giving myself a silent pep talk. There had to be a logical reason, but the marks on my body grew more concerning. Some mornings I'd discover odd imprints across my chest or arms, like outlines of fabric that I didn't recognize. At first, I doubted my own memory. Perhaps I had worn a particular outfit before bed and simply forgotten, but I didn't own any shirts with those patterned seams. Panic fluttered in my throat, and an invisible hand seemed to squeeze my lungs whenever I inspected these impressions. It was as though my reflection, which I'd occasionally see wearing slightly different clothes, was imprinting its wardrobe onto my skin. One night I tried taking a photo of the mirror to document its unsettling state, but each time I snapped a picture, the resulting image showed only a dark haze, as if a black fog hovered where the mirror should have been. There was no reflection of the room at all. I tried different angles, lighting, even a short video. Each recording yielded nothing but swirling darkness. The only sign that a mirror was there at all was the vague rectangular shape of the frame. That was the final straw. My heart felt like it was thrumming too quickly for my chest. I was short of breath, hands clammy and trembling around my phone. Something was undeniably wrong. After that, I tried covering the mirror with a large sheet. I convinced myself that out of sight would be out of mind. That night, I slept more soundly than I had in a long time, until a muffled sound jerked me awake in the middle of the night. It was a strange scraping, like fabric shifting across wood. I lay in bed with every muscle tense, fear coiled in my gut. The scraping sound came again, and my scalp prickled. Slowly, I got up, my breath shallow, and tiptoed into the living room. The blanket I had used to cover the mirror was crumpled on the floor, as though yanked down with force. and the mirror stood there, its surface faintly glimmering with the glow from a street lamp outside. The reflection looked normal enough at a glance, but something about its posture made bile rise in my throat. It was leaning in, just the slightest bit, with shoulders angled as if it were listening for something. My heart hammered, and I stifled a yelp, stepping back into the safety of my bedroom and locking the door. I didn't sleep after that. I paced the room, cold sweat breaking out along my temples, my eyes darting to the small mirror above my dresser to confirm my own reflection was acting normal. It was. I considered calling a friend to come over, but I imagined how that conversation would go. I'd have to explain that my antique mirror seemed to have a will of its own. Nobody would take me seriously. I didn't even know if I believed it myself. The next few days were a blur of anxiety and mounting paranoia. Every time I walked past that mirror, now uncovered because covering it clearly served no purpose, my stomach would clench, and a chill would shoot through my veins. I noticed that the face staring back from that antique glass was paler, with the faintest hint of dark circles under the eyes. By comparison, when I looked in my normal mirror, I didn't appear quite so drawn. I was definitely tired, but my complexion wasn't as ghostly. It became harder to ignore the feeling that I was being watched from inside that antique frame. Occasionally, I caught the reflection moving in ways I wasn't moving. I would stand still, breath trapped in my throat, and watch my reflection tilt its head a fraction to the side when I hadn't moved at all. My hands shook so violently that I sometimes had to grip my own wrists just to steady them. At night, the mirror seemed to emit a faint, almost inaudible hum. Or maybe it was my imagination. Still, I could feel the vibrations in my chest, making my heart flutter like a trapped bird. Desperate, I attempted to do some research. I spent hours poring over old articles and folklore on antique mirrors. I discovered stories of mirrors that supposedly trapped spirits or absorbed negative energy over the centuries. Reading these accounts, my heart throbbed in my throat. I read about old traditions where people covered mirrors after someone fell ill, so that no wandering spirit could latch onto the living. Those stories made my skin crawl. Even though I read them as a skeptic, my current situation was pushing me beyond the realm of reason. I reached a point where being home alone terrified me. Every time I had to walk through the living room, my spine would tense, anticipating some new horror. One morning, as I was leaving for work, I glanced in the mirror and felt my stomach plummet. My reflection's eyes were almost black, the whites just barely visible. That same unsettling smile flickered across its lips, as if mocking me. My hand flew to my mouth, stifling a cry. Even though I had no intention of speaking to it directly, I found myself mumbling under my breath that I wasn't afraid. Of course, the wild beating of my heart and the sweat forming at my temples betrayed me. I left the apartment feeling like I might vomit from sheer tension. That entire day, I couldn't focus. My boss asked me if everything was okay, noticing my pale complexion and jittery demeanor. I nodded hastily, assured him it was just a passing bug. But inside, I felt a crushing sense of foreboding. My own reflection was out to get me, or at the very least was interfering with my sense of reality in a way that made me question my sanity. When I closed my eyes, I saw that twisted half-smile, and my pulse raced uncontrollably. Returning home that night, I turned on all the lights immediately. The living room was painfully bright, as though I were trying to keep the darkness at bay by force. The mirror still swallowed enough light to look dim and lifeless. Exhaustion clung to my bones, yet I couldn't bring myself to go to sleep. Instead, I paced the apartment, trembling from both fear and frustration. It struck me that I needed to confront the mirror in some way or rid myself of it. But I couldn't just throw it away. Something in me felt that if I put it out on the street, that ominous presence would still follow me. That, or someone else would bring it into their home. I also worried that if I simply smashed it, I might unleash something worse. I made a choice. I would try to banish it, in a sense. That night, I set up a small table beside the mirror and lit a plain white candle. I'd read somewhere that mirrors and flames have a unique relationship. Something about the flicker of light can disrupt negative energies. Perhaps it was just a superstition, but I was desperate enough to try anything. As I stood in front of the mirror, candlelight dancing on its surface, my heartbeat roared in my ears. The reflection stared back, but its eyes were so dark they might as well have been pits. I felt a cold sweat break out along my back. My stomach clenched painfully when I realized the reflection's lips were moving slightly. My own lips were pressed into a trembling line. Yet in that flickering glow, I saw my reflection forming words, though I heard no sound. My chest felt tight, and goosebumps exploded across my arms. I stumbled backward, nearly knocking over the candle. Trying to steady myself, I felt the raw terror surfacing, like someone had poured ice-cold water down my spine. I could see the reflection leaning closer. A wave of revulsion and panic rippled through me, and I couldn't bring myself to watch any longer. With a surge of adrenaline, I grabbed a thick blanket, flung it over the mirror, and dragged it out of my apartment, down the steps to the basement storage area. My hands shook so violently that I nearly dropped it on the way. My breathing was ragged, and my vision blurred with anxiety. Once I had it in the basement, I shoved it into a corner behind shelves of old paint cans and tools. My heart still pounded like a jackhammer. A part of me expected the reflection to leap from beneath the blanket. Every creak of the building made me jump, and I could almost swear I heard faint laughter under my own labored breathing. I forced myself to leave it there and return to my apartment, chest heaving with a combination of dread and relief. I slept fitfully that night, but I did sleep. In the morning, I woke up feeling slightly better, until I saw fresh red marks on my arms. They wrapped around my biceps like tight sleeves, matching the rolled-up cuffs I had last seen the reflection wearing. My breathing turned shallow, and my heart slammed painfully against my ribs. It felt like a warning, as if the mirror had left its mark on me even from the basement. My reflection in my regular bedroom mirror still looked tired and shaken, but at least it wasn't out of sync. Rather than let my panic consume me, I forced myself to get ready. My ears were buzzing with anxiety as I brewed coffee, and every shadow made me jump. But the day passed, and nothing else happened. The next day, no new marks appeared. Slowly, I began to relax, though the tension never left completely. I decided that maybe the distance had lessened the mirror's hold on me. Finally, about a week later, I mustered the courage to peek into the basement. The blanket was still in place, no obvious signs that it had been disturbed. I stood there for a moment, feeling an uneasy presence lingering in the stale air. My stomach twisted in knots, but I felt a strange sense of triumph. Perhaps I had contained it, or at least put enough space between us, that it couldn't affect me anymore. To this day, I haven't tried to remove the mirror from that spot. Every so often, a chill creeps over me when I think about what might be happening beneath that blanket. The building's basement has an eerie hum, and I occasionally hear quiet scraping noises that make me freeze in place. But I haven't touched the mirror again, and I refuse to check my phone down there for fear of seeing that swirling darkness through my camera lens. Sometimes, late at night, I still feel something brushing against my skin. A fleeting echo of the reflection's grin, maybe. My heart will race out of nowhere, and I'll find myself listening for subtle sounds in the walls. But I've managed to avoid further direct encounters. I can't say I'm free of it, but I've learned to live around it. My design work has improved a bit, since I no longer stare into those dark eyes before bed. I still wake up with bruises or odd marks from time to time, but they're less frequent and they fade quickly. Maybe the mirror is slowly letting go, or maybe it's biding its time. Either way, I'd rather not find out. I've told myself that I will move apartments soon, leave the mirror behind. Yet, part of me wonders if I can truly escape it. The reflection's grin still haunts me every time I close my eyes. Whatever is locked inside that antique frame is real enough to leave physical traces on my body. I've felt its malevolence, seen its smile. The only comfort I have is that I haven't seen the reflection's face in weeks. But that doesn't stop the suffocating sense of being watched, or the inkling that at any moment I might pass a shiny surface and catch a glimpse of that pale visage, smiling back at me with those dark, hollow eyes. And if it does reappear, I'm not entirely sure I'll be able to look away. Story 12. A sudden chill pressed against the back of my neck the moment I cracked open the loose floorboard in the old living room. It was late afternoon, the setting sun bleeding streaks of crimson light across the hardwood, and something about the silence felt wrong, like the house was holding its breath, waiting. I remember the way the hair on my arms stood on end when I knelt down, flashlight trembling in my grip. The beam of light revealed scratched symbols I couldn't understand, carved in uneven spirals beneath the floor. It looked ancient and deliberate, as though someone had spent years painstakingly gouging lines into the wood. Even before I read any notes or records, I had the sense that these markings were not just relics of some harmless ritual. They were alive with malevolence, echoing with an unspoken threat that clung to the air. My name is Richard, and I'm a therapist. I never considered myself the superstitious type. I believe in tangible evidence, in forging trust with patients through empathy and clinical understanding. In my professional life, I rely on logic and emotional intelligence, not on half-glimpsed shadows or mysterious carvings hidden beneath my own house. Yet from the moment I found those ominous symbols, my carefully built sense of reason started to slip. The house seemed to change somehow, warping its ambience like a shape in a funhouse mirror. Every step I took sent an unsettling creak through the walls, as if the structure itself was letting out a series of low, anxious sighs. And that chill at the back of my neck, it never went away. I had purchased this property a few months back. It was a sturdy old place, built in the late 1800s but lovingly maintained, or so I thought. My plan was to convert one of the larger rooms into a home office for my therapy sessions, bringing clients into an environment that felt warm and comforting. It was the kind of place with wide windows, creaking floorboards, and a long history that, at first glance, seemed quaint. But gradually, small things began to feel off. The atmosphere turned stifling, like the air was laden with a subtle tension that pricked at my patience. I found myself losing my temper over trivial matters. If I stubbed my toe on a chair or misplaced my keys, a surge of disproportionate anger would flare within me. It made no sense. I'm usually calm, even under stress. Then I started to notice objects shifting locations. It was always minor at first, the mug on my desk ending up on a shelf without my recollection, or a pen rolling off into a corner as if nudged by an unseen hand. I told a colleague about these incidents in passing, indirectly conveying my concern that the house might be playing tricks on me. He suggested I might be overworked, that maybe I was unconsciously moving objects under stress. But something in my gut told me this was more than exhaustion. There was a presence in the house, a quiet watchfulness that made my every footstep feel like an intrusion. When I lifted that floorboard and discovered the ritualistic markings, I decided to do some searching in the basement and attic, hoping to piece together the puzzle. In a dusty trunk, I came across a set of yellowed journals that seemed to document activities spanning several decades. They described a cult, though the exact name was never clearly stated, that apparently used this house as a place to harvest negative emotions. According to these journals, heated arguments and emotional outbursts acted like offerings. The more anger, fear, and despair that filled the rooms, the more powerful something beneath the house became. Reading those words made my heart thump so hard I thought it might punch straight through my ribcage. A deep, primal dread coiled in my stomach, as though I'd opened a forbidden door. I remember sifting through pages of shaky handwriting that recounted bizarre rituals. The authors wrote of chanting in the dead of night, encouraging conflict among residents, and storing that energy in hidden vessels marked with cryptic symbols. One passage mentioned that these harvests had to be refreshed continually. Otherwise, the entity, or whatever it was, would turn on the cult members themselves. My breathing grew ragged as I took in those lines, feeling a knot of anxiety tighten in my chest. I tried to reassure myself that it was all nonsense, just the feverish ramblings of a twisted group from the past. Yet the unsettled feeling in my home, the uncontrollable flashes of anger I'd felt, suggested otherwise. The house was like a living organism, feeding on strife and stoking fury in my veins. As the days passed, I became more and more convinced that I wasn't imagining things. When I attempted to patch up the floorboard to hide those symbols, it felt as though the house resisted. The nails wouldn't catch, the wood warped strangely, and I ended up slamming my fist against the plank in sheer frustration. A jagged piece of wood cut my palm, and blood dripped onto the markings. In that moment, I felt a pulse beneath my feet, as if the floor itself trembled with anticipation. My anger flared into a red-hot rage. I lashed out at the wall, cursing the house under my breath. Then, as swiftly as it came, the fury subsided, replaced by a confusion so profound I sank to my knees, shaking. I tried to keep a professional mindset despite these unnerving occurrences, especially since my clients were scheduled to visit. I even set up a small recording device in my new office to review my therapy sessions later, hoping that listening to them might ground me. On the first day I used it, a subtle but unsettling pattern appeared. Whenever a client expressed frustration or grief, there was a faint static in the audio. On reviewing the recordings later that night, I caught something that made every hair on my body stand erect. During moments of heightened emotional distress, faint, distorted laughter trickled through the speakers. It didn't sound like normal laughter either. It had a wet, guttural edge. My jaw clenched so tight I felt my molars grind. I found myself unable to sleep, heart pounding as I replayed those snippets over and over, trying to find a rational explanation. The tension in the house kept escalating, and so did my own irritability. I found myself snapping at acquaintances over innocuous remarks, feeling an anger that was far beyond my normal range. The walls seemed to groan more frequently, pipes rattled in the dead of night. Doors would creak open on their own, and cold drafts wound through the halls. More disturbing was the growing sense that I was being observed. Several times I thought I saw a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision, shadows that dashed away the moment I turned my head. The floor would let out a single isolated creak behind me, even when I was standing still. More than once I looked in the mirror and caught an expression on my face I didn't recognize, some unsettling blend of fury and desperation. No matter how much I tried to maintain my composure, the oppressive energy in the house weighed on my chest like a millstone. I slept only a few hours each night, jolting awake with a gasp and a cold film of sweat on my forehead. My heart hammered at odd times, an inexplicable panic stirring as if my body were anticipating an unseen threat. The tension in my shoulders turned into constant aches, and I began to dread simply returning home at the end of the day. I would loiter in my car, inhaling shallow breaths, mustering the courage to walk through the front door. Some nights, the house arranged accidents that felt more orchestrated than random. A frying pan slid off the stove just as I reached for it, nearly scalding my arm. A framed painting in the hall dropped right in front of me, glass shattering at my feet. Each time I felt a weird surge of adrenaline, accompanied by an almost gleeful sense of menace in the air. It was like the house wanted to provoke me, to make me lash out in fear or anger. Every angry outburst I emitted reverberated through the rooms, swallowed up by the house like a starving beast devouring a morsel. Desperate for answers, I dug deeper into the journals, rummaging through scattered notes and sketches. My eyes caught on an old newspaper clipping tucked between the pages. The article described a series of mysterious disruptions in the neighborhood, bizarre episodes of aggression and conflict dating back half a century. Neighbors reported hearing loud arguments echoing from these walls, sometimes culminating in violent rifts between friends and family members. Though the article was vague on details, it hinted that the house had a long history of fostering hostility. There were references to local rumors that once you stepped inside, your darkest impulses were magnified. Reading that, I began to question my own sanity. Was I truly experiencing something supernatural, or was it my own emotional baggage manifesting in a crumbling house? I felt the sting of shame thinking about how I, a trained therapist, could be undone by invisible influences. Yet the mounting evidence was impossible to ignore. Late one night, I recorded an impromptu session with myself, speaking into the device as though I were my own patient. My voice shook on playback, and again that alien laughter formed in the background. It felt like a violation, as if something was mocking my vulnerability. What rattled me most was the sense that the house thrived on my confusion. The more uncertain and afraid I became, The heavier the atmosphere grew, pressing in around me like suffocating hands. I tried clearing the negative energy by rearranging furniture, lighting calming scents, playing soothing music, anything to shift the tension. But these efforts felt like a feeble attempt to fight a hurricane with a candle flame. One evening, I slammed my fist on the kitchen table in frustration. The lights flickered, and a thick hush enveloped the house. My pulse sped up, a bolt of dread jolting through me. Then, from somewhere deep within the walls, I swear I heard that guttural laughter again, quiet yet filled with triumph. It was then I realized that escape might be my only option, but a stubborn sense of responsibility kept me rooted. This was my home, my place of practice. I had poured so many resources into it already. I wrestled with the decision for days, pacing the corridors with sweat beading on my brow, unsettled by fleeting reflections in the windows. Eventually, I decided I had to confront this entity, or whatever remained of the cult's influence, head on. I resolved to remove the floorboards in the living room entirely, revealing the carved symbols in full, then document them. I hoped that facing the runes might lift the power they held. Late one afternoon, I pulled out my tools and forced myself to remove every last board. My palms were slick with sweat, and my heartbeat thundered in my ears. With each plank yanked away, I felt the house shudder, as though in protest. After hours of labor, the final section of the markings lay exposed. Intricate, spiraling designs that made my vision swim. An oppressive silence surrounded me, and I felt cold air rush against my face as if an invisible door had opened. My mind conjured the disturbing thought that perhaps I was releasing something rather than banishing it. My breath caught in my throat as I spotted a small wooden box nestled among the beams. Inside it, I found old scraps of parchment and a broken stone figurine. Unreadable script wound across the parchment in a language I didn't recognize. The figurine was shaped vaguely like a crouching creature, its face twisted into an expression of rapturous glee. The second I touched it, a jolt shot up my arm, and an overwhelming dizziness crashed over me. My knees buckled. I collapsed onto the floor, panting as if I had run a marathon, every muscle shaking uncontrollably. But I forced myself to stand. My entire body quivered and my lungs felt as though they were filled with ice water. I reached for the broken figurine, gripping it tightly. A roiling anger filled my chest, an echo of all the negative emotions the house had fed upon. My mind buzzed with fear, rage, confusion. I understood on some primal level that this was the focal point, the anchor of that ancient practice. I steeled myself, jaw set, and carried it up the basement steps, out the back door, and into the yard. The house seemed to groan behind me, timbers creaking like a wounded beast. My breath came in ragged bursts, my heart pounding. Without allowing myself to hesitate, I hurled the figurine across the yard into a cluster of dense bushes, yanking my hand away as though it were stained. In that instant, a faint wind gust rattled the windows. I shivered, goosebumps trailing up my arms. The oppressive weight in the atmosphere lifted, but not completely. It receded just enough for me to breathe without feeling like I was suffocating. I stood there, trembling and soaked in cold sweat, feeling the chill of the approaching night creep across my skin. My senses were on high alert, waiting for some final parting shot of malevolence. By the time I mustered the courage to walk back inside, darkness had fallen. The house was quieter than I'd ever known it to be, though a subtle tension still flickered at the edges of my awareness. Part of me wondered if I had only scratched the surface, if the real horror was buried deeper than I could ever dig. Yet something about confronting that box, that figurine, made me feel marginally more in control. I still caught a few flickers in the corner of my eye, and I had a nagging suspicion the floor might never truly be free of those carvings. Even so, I refused to let the house dominate me any longer. I slept fitfully that night, plagued by half-formed nightmares of twisted laughter and creeping silhouettes. But I woke up with a fresh determination. Over the next days, the house felt different, still uneasy, still brimming with potential conflict, but somehow less aggressive. My anger no longer surged so violently. Items stayed more or less where I put them. The pipes rattled occasionally, Yet the oppressive sense of being watched had lessened. A lingering disquiet remains, a subtle electricity in the air that sets my nerves on edge. I don't think I'll ever feel fully at ease in these rooms, knowing what has transpired here, aware of how easily one can lose control under the influence of something so intangible yet potent. The journals, the carvings, the sinister laughter captured on my tapes. They've opened a chasm in my mind. Sometimes I suspect the house is just waiting for the right trigger to stir its appetite again. Even on calmer days, I catch glimpses of movement in the reflections of glass, or hear faint giggles in the static of my recordings. I've learned the hard way that some places are not merely dwellings. They are entities that can shape your emotions and unravel your sanity. Though I remain uncertain whether I can truly banish whatever still lingers here, I've chosen to stay, for now. In a way, it's become a test of my own will. I continue my therapy practice, reminding myself to be vigilant. I keep my voice recorder running during sessions, checking for that haunting laugh. Mostly, the tapes are silent now, filled only with the usual talk of life's sorrows and struggles. Yet every so often there's a faint static, a distant echo I can't quite decipher. It sends a shiver down my spine, reminding me that the house is listening, and that, perhaps, is the real terror. Knowing that something ancient dwells beneath the surface, feeding off our darkest feelings, always waiting to taste them again. Even if I manage to hold on to my composure and remain vigilant, the house breathes around me, an unceasing presence that thrives on tension and fear. It's a relationship I've yet to fully comprehend, a parasite and its host, or maybe a shadow that only grows longer in the fading light. Whenever I walk across that living room floor, I swear I can sense a pulse in the boards, a faint thrum that might just be my own heartbeat, or something else, alive, biding its time. And each night, before I finally drift into restless sleep, I remind myself to stay calm, remain strong, and above all, never feed the darkness that has made its nest beneath my home. Story 13. I felt something was terribly wrong the moment I stepped into that cold, fluorescent-lit corridor. Maybe it was the stifling air or the low hum of faulty lights overhead, but a crawling unease settled in my stomach before I even saw the elevator's doors quiver. Standing there, the entire hospital around me felt oddly still, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something vile to unfold. My heartbeat spiked, each pulsing thud echoing in my ears. For a long moment, I just stared at the elevator's closed metal panels, resisting an urge to walk away. My name is Isaac, and I've been a technician for 20 years. I've repaired squeaking metal gears in rundown factories and labyrinthine escalators in desolate malls. But this hospital job felt different the moment I arrived. I was supposed to fix a simple alignment glitch in the elevator's doors. Nothing more. I remember feeling a prickling paranoia as soon as I took my first step into that hallway. It was the hush in the air, the sensation of unseen eyes trailing my every move, and the quiet tension that vibrated off the walls, like an unsettled presence coiling around me. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was just tired from an early morning start. But deep down, I knew this job was going to be like nothing I'd ever experienced. When I first pried open the elevator's control panel, I noticed the usual tangle of wires. Nothing seemed out of place. The overhead light flickered, casting shifting shadows against the stainless steel interior. I told a nurse passing by that I'd be working on it for a couple of hours, and that she might want to use the elevator in the opposite wing. She nodded, but something in her gaze made me uncomfortable. She looked at me for half a beat longer than she needed to, as though she was sizing me up or silently warning me. Once she was gone, I felt oddly isolated. My palms felt clammy despite the cool temperature. My breath grew shallow, and the air tasted stale. The metal in my toolbox clanged louder than usual, making me jump. I found nothing to explain the elevator's reported malfunction, so I stepped inside to test it, pressing the first floor button. The carriage rattled, groaning softly as it descended. My heart rate leveled out, and I almost laughed at myself for feeling nervous over nothing. Then, without my pressing another button, the elevator lurched to a stop on the fifth floor. The doors slid open smoothly. No one was waiting. The corridor looked normal, except for an odd flickering overhead light. I shrugged it off as a random glitch, but something about the atmosphere felt charged, like static electricity, making the hairs on my arms stand at attention. I walked out, listened to the silence, and then stepped back inside. It happened a few more times. The elevator refused to do as it was told. I'd press the second or third floor, but it would insist on stopping on the fifth. Each time, the corridor on the fifth looked just as it should. Drab beige walls, fluorescent lights, and a row of patient rooms. Yet there was a subtle shift in the air, like stepping into a place where time hung heavier. I remember an uncanny sense of déjà vu. My pulse quickened each time, and a tightening in my chest told me I wasn't alone, even when there was no one else in sight. The next day, the malfunction grew stranger. As I rode the elevator to check the control panel on the basement level, it stopped once more on the fifth floor. This time, the doors opened to a scene that nearly made me drop my toolbox. A group of doctors, clad in what looked like outdated medical uniforms, white coats with archaic logos, hurried through the corridor. Their voices were muffled, as though filtered by a wall of static. The fluorescent lights had been replaced by flickering lanterns set on metal stands. I watched in disbelief, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. My legs felt rooted to the elevator floor, adrenaline spiking hard enough that I tasted bile in my throat. Then, in the blink of an eye, the corridor was back to normal. No lanterns, no antique uniforms. I stood there panting, my arms trembling. The only sound was my own ragged breathing reverberating in the empty hallway. I tried to explain what I saw to a maintenance supervisor in an indirect way, insisting that something was off about that elevator. He offered to send me an assistant, but I declined, not wanting to come across as someone who was losing his grip on reality. Deep down, though, my mind was reeling. Each nerve in my body felt frayed. I began dreading that ding announcing the fifth floor. My sleep that night was restless, haunted by swirling images of flickering lanterns and rapid footsteps echoing in deserted hallways. Still, I went back the next day, determined to figure out the cause of this bizarre phenomenon. Armed with my tools and an odd mixture of dread and stubbornness, I stepped into the elevator again. I pressed the basement button, bracing myself. My heart hammered so loudly it drowned out every other sound. Sure enough, the elevator jerked, shook violently for a second, and stopped. The doors slid open, revealing the corridor on the fifth floor, but it wasn't the modern hospital corridor anymore. Everything looked older, like something from archival photographs I once saw in a museum. The paint on the walls had a dull, yellowish hue, and the overhead lights were dim and cast strange, dancing shadows. The rancid smell of harsh disinfectants hung thick in the air, stinging my nose. Down the hall, I saw silhouettes moving behind frosted glass. I could hear faint murmurs of conversation and the shuffle of footsteps. The blood pounded in my temples. My breathing turned shallow, and a sticky perspiration clung to my forehead. Even though fear twisted my stomach into knots, I stepped forward. The moment my foot touched the corridor, I was overwhelmed by a sharp sense of displacement. It was as though I'd slipped out of my own timeline. The nurses and doctors I could glimpse wore uniforms decades out of fashion. The instrumentation seemed archaic. Metal syringes, glass free bottles, and old-fashioned scalpels. I couldn't believe what my eyes were registering. I pressed my hand against the wall to steady myself, feeling the cold, chipped paint under my fingertips. A wave of dizziness made my vision blur. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, the scene blinked out. The corridor was back to its usual unremarkable state. I stumbled back into the elevator, my heart hammering so fiercely it made my ribs ache. I collapsed against the wall, panting and trying to steady my trembling hands. Before I even realized it, I pressed the button for the ground floor, desperate to escape. Once the doors closed, I started to calm down, or so I thought. Only when I reached into my pocket to grab my phone did I notice the cold metal object nestled in there. I pulled it out, my stomach lurching. It was a small, antique scalpel. The handle was worn, the blade stained with tarnish. My brain refused to accept how it got there. My mind raced. Had I picked it up without realizing it? I didn't remember touching anything. I felt sweat trickling down my face and tried to compose myself. I wrapped the scalpel in a rag and shoved it in my toolbox, my hand still shaking so badly I almost dropped it. The rest of the day blurred into a haze of mechanical tasks I forced myself to do. But I couldn't shake the heaviness in my chest, the anxiety pulsing in my veins. My mouth was perpetually dry, and every time a corridor light flickered, my pulse skyrocketed. That night, a gnawing terror invaded my dreams. I saw rows of doctors in an antiquated operating room, huddled around a metal table with instruments that gleamed ominously. They worked on an unseen figure, but I heard no cries of pain. The only sound was the scraping of metal on metal and the staccato tap of footsteps echoing against linoleum floors. I awoke drenched in sweat, heart racing. The following morning I examined the mysterious scalpel under better light. It bore an inscription I couldn't decipher, some archaic lettering. An uneasy chill crawled up my spine. Thoughts of returning to the hospital filled me with dread. But work was work. I had a job to do, and a part of me needed an explanation, some logic to make sense of the impossible. When I arrived, I found that the hospital staff had put in a new request. The elevator was making unscheduled stops at random hours, sometimes traveling all the way to the roof, sometimes plummeting to the basement with no command given. One nurse had even reported hearing faint voices in the shaft when no one was inside. My breath caught in my chest as I realized these weren't ordinary malfunctions. Reluctantly, I inspected the machinery behind the fifth-floor access panel. Everything looked normal. No frayed wires, no compromised circuits. Yet a feeling of foreboding made it feel like the walls were closing in on me. The temperature in the cramped space seemed to drop, my breath coming out in shaky gasps. I heard faint footsteps in the corridor. Turning off my flashlight, I peered out. The lights overhead dimmed to a sickly yellow glow. My reflection in the polished floor looked distorted, as if the overhead lights were flickering in slow motion. Then I saw them again, those doctors and nurses from another era moving hurriedly. Their faces were partially shadowed, features unreadable. Their voices sounded like they were submerged underwater, garbled and distant. My body went rigid, every muscle coiled in tension, a surge of panic electrifying my nerves. I spotted what looked like an old gurney with metal wheels squeaking in protest as it was pushed along. Trying to block out the surge of terror, I clutched the control panel's edge. For a fleeting moment, the entire hall was awash in a dull, sepia-like tone. My chest felt like it was collapsing in on itself. The smell of antiseptics burned my nostrils. A wave of vertigo crashed over me. Then, just like that, it ended. The corridor returned to its modern, fluorescent-lit state. The only evidence of the bizarre shift was the cold sweat running down my back and the terror pounding in my heart. That night, I discovered an old surgical clamp in my jacket pocket when I got home. Its metal edges dug into my palm, as if mocking me. I sank onto my couch, feeling nauseous and overwhelmed. How was this happening? Was I blacking out and stealing hospital artifacts? The realization that I might be losing my grip on reality made my limbs feel weak. My breath came in shallow bursts, my heart fluttering erratically in my chest. A creeping dread washed over me, the kind that makes your skin crawl and your mind spiral into worst-case scenarios. Over the next few days, the bizarre incidents escalated. I began to notice that each time the elevator stopped unexpectedly on the fifth floor, I'd have a flash of knowledge I couldn't explain, like how to suture a wound or sterilize archaic medical tools. My dreams became more vivid, suffused with lurid images of old operating theaters and archaic procedures. I'd bolt awake to find my arms covered in goosebumps and my pillow soaked with sweat. On one particularly harrowing night, I awoke mid-scream, convinced I had the smell of ether on my hands. I started avoiding the elevator whenever possible. I used the stairs, my heart pounding with exertion by the time I reached the top floors. Even then, I felt a presence behind me, as though someone was climbing each step with me. My paranoia ran wild. Every squeak of a hallway door or flicker of a fluorescent tube sent jolts of adrenaline coursing through me. My coworkers noticed my ragged appearance and asked if I was sleeping poorly. I gave non-committal answers, not wanting to voice my fears aloud. I was beginning to question my sanity. At times, I half believed I was hallucinating. Eventually, I resolved to confront it one last time. I was convinced that the elevator was some sort of portal, or maybe a trigger that bent the hospital's timeline in ways I couldn't comprehend. I told myself that if I could see the phenomenon clearly, maybe I could break its hold on me. Heart hammering in my chest, I stepped into the elevator after hours, carrying my toolbox more like a security blanket than a set of tools. The hospital corridors were nearly empty, dimmed lights throwing long shadows against the walls. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to turn back, but I pressed the 5th floor button and waited. The descent was smooth until the elevator shook and the lights flickered. My stomach lurched as it ground to a halt. The doors slid open onto the past. This time, the corridor was fully transformed. Overhead fixtures glowed with a weak, yellowish light. I saw a doctor in a starched white coat rush by, holding an old-fashioned metal tray of instruments. My pulse thundered, my throat dried up. The air crackled with tension, heavy with antiseptic fumes. It felt so real, more vivid than ever before. I forced one foot forward. A tremor ran through my body, but I kept going. Each step echoed loudly in the corridor. The hospital rooms looked outdated, their doors made of heavy wood, the glass windows clouded with age. The hush was suffocating. My breathing turned ragged, ears straining for any sign of movement. Then I heard faint murmurs and caught a glimpse of a medical procedure in progress through the open door of what looked like an old operating room. Lanterns flickered, casting ominous shadows on the walls. At that moment, I realized I understood exactly what they were doing, as though I'd studied these old procedures for years. Fear mingled with a bizarre sense of familiarity. My mind reeled, and I felt on the brink of collapse. Clutching the doorframe for balance, I watched as they manipulated instruments just like the ones I'd found in my pockets. My own fingers tingled with a phantom memory of holding those tools. A wave of nausea battered me. My vision blurred and a cold sweat coated my skin. Somewhere in my mind, I knew I had to get out. This place, this impossible overlap of times, was enveloping me, threading itself through my mind. My body screamed for escape, so I turned and stumbled back toward the elevator. My heart pounded a frantic tattoo against my ribs. The corridor seemed to stretch, lengthening with each shaky step. I could hear the squeal of old gurney wheels behind me, a grotesque punctuation to my mounting terror. Finally, I stumbled through the elevator doors and slammed my fist on the close button. For a tense moment, nothing happened. Then the doors slid shut with a metallic clang, and the elevator roared to life. When the doors opened on the ground floor, everything looked normal. Typical modern hospital decor. But my hands wouldn't stop shaking. My heart wouldn't settle. I noticed my pockets felt heavier. Upon reaching in, I felt not just one or two, but several antique medical instruments stuffed inside. My stomach twisted at the realization that this horrifying link to the past was still clinging to me. In a surge of revulsion, I threw them onto the floor. They clattered, the sound echoing in the sterile corridor. A security guard rushed over, concerned by the noise. I only gave him a bewildered look. He asked if I was all right. I nodded vaguely, claiming I'd just dropped some equipment. My voice was hollow, my eyes surely betraying the panic rattling inside me. I left that hospital that night without finishing the job, walking as fast as my shaky legs would allow. Each step felt like I was trying to outrun the ghosts clinging to my mind. Once outside, the cool night air hit me, and I nearly collapsed from the relief of being away from that suffocating place. My throat was raw, my limbs numb with exhaustion. In the following days, I filed a report that I could not complete the repairs due to personal circumstances. I offered to find a replacement technician. I had to force myself to appear calm in those emails, but in truth, my sleep was haunted by the dreadful scene in that old operating room. My hands still tingled with knowledge I never studied. My pockets sometimes felt unnaturally heavy, even when empty. Each night, I'd wake in a cold sweat, the smell of musty disinfectants lingering in my nostrils. I haven't returned to that hospital since. Part of me fears that if I step foot in that building, I'll never truly come back. The knowledge that I've glimpsed another time, or maybe another reality, gnaws at the edges of my sanity. Sometimes I catch my reflection in the mirror and see a man who looks hollowed out, eyes ringed with dark circles, filled with a perpetual flicker of dread. I try to tell myself it's over, that the past can't reach me here. But each time I close my eyes, I see those sepia-toned corridors and hear the echoing squeak of metal wheels. I sense the presence of those figures roaming an older, darker version of the hospital, their voices trapped between walls of time. Even now, my heart lurches whenever I hear an elevator chime. A twisted part of me wonders if that hospital elevator still stops unbidden on the 5th floor, waiting for someone else to witness those impossible scenes. The question plagues my dreams and taints my waking hours. Sometimes I sense a faint pulse in my fingertips, as if itching to hold those archaic instruments again. The rational part of me knows that I should never go back. Yet the compulsion lurks, a nagging whisper in the back of my mind. And so I exist in this uneasy truce, haunted by the knowledge I never wanted, and shackled by the memory of that impossible corridor. I escaped the elevator, yes, but some part of me stayed behind, lost in the flicker between present and past, tethered to a moment that defies explanation. I doubt the feeling of that place will ever leave me. It clings to me like a second skin, tightening around my chest whenever I recall the hiss of those old lanterns or the chilling hush of those timeless hallways. I've learned the hard way that not every door should be opened, not every anomaly should be fixed. Some things defy reason, existing in the cracks between reality and nightmare, and once you've walked in those corridors, you never truly step out again.